Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, a quiet corner where curiosity stretches out its limbs, settles in, and takes its time exploring the mysteries that hover just beyond the reach of ordinary days. Tonight we're easing into one of those old questions that's been folded into myths, stitched into legends, and whispered in the background of astronomy for generations. It's the idea that humanity might not have begun here at all, that our story could have started far from this planet, on a world that wanders through the dark like a lone traveller following a distant, repeating path. Some people call that world Nibiru, others speak of it as the home of the Anunnaki, a place where life might have taken a different shape before it ever settled onto Earth. And even if you treat this as speculation, or a story from the very edges of recorded memory, there's something strangely comforting about leaning into possibilities that don't fit into everyday boxes. Sometimes those are the ones that help the mind slow down and wander gently through ideas that don't rush toward conclusions. Before we drift deeper, I'd really like to know where you're listening from tonight. A small room with soft lights, a living room couch, a late train making its steady way across the countryside. It's always interesting how people gather around these stories from so many places. What time is it where you are right now? Early morning, late evening, or one of those in-between hours that has its own quiet atmosphere? Whatever moment you're in, I'm glad you're here. And if this kind of slow, steady exploration helps you unwind or fills the space around you with something peaceful, a like or a subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps these calm stories find others who might also be looking for a gentle place to rest. So let's begin letting this idea breathe. Humanity coming from another world sounds like something pulled straight from a science fiction shelf, but it's a thought that has lived for much longer than modern novels. It slips through Sumerian myths, appears in old tablets, resurfaces in the language of the ancient Near East, and carries with it the suggestion that maybe our species wasn't simply born on this planet in the way we usually imagine. When people speak about Nibiru, they often describe it as a world with a long-distant orbit, something that moves so slowly and so far from the familiar paths of our solar system that its return becomes an event drifting across tens of thousands of years. It's not something you'd see with the naked eye, not a bright point of light in the night sky, but a world that could have passed near Earth in a time before writing, before agriculture, before anything that would have kept a record. The idea that life might have come from such a place isn't really unique when you think about how scientists talk about panspermia, or the possibility that simple building blocks of biology might travel between worlds on rocks, or fragments drifting from collisions. What makes the Nibiru idea different is the suggestion that it wasn't just random chemical particles arriving here, but intelligent beings who already had a grasp of engineering, language, astronomy, and something resembling a structured society. The thought alone changes the way you picture the earliest days of our species. It doesn't replace what science has found about human origins on Earth, but it creates a second story that runs beside the first, moving at its own pace. Imagine that distant world for a moment, not in an overly dramatic way, but simply as a place shaped by different rhythms, temperatures and cycles. If Nibiru had a long-stretched orbit, then seasons there might last longer than lifetimes. Days and nights could follow patterns unfamiliar to us. Its sky would hold a different combination of stars, the same universe but arranged from another angle. Life forming in such an environment would adapt to pressures we don't experience, and the beings who might have evolved there could carry traits shaped by long periods of cold, heat, or darkness. We don't need to make them larger than life. Just imagining a group of people shaped by their environment the same way any species would be shaped by ours helps the idea settle into something more grounded. Now picture those hypothetical visitors arriving here. They wouldn't have stepped onto a planet full of civilizations, cities, languages, or borders. Instead, they would have found Earth in a raw, early state, with landscapes forming and reforming, forests expanding, oceans shifting, and life emerging in its simplest forms. If the Anunnaki story has even a grain of memory inside it, those early visitors might have seen Earth as a place with potential, a world that wasn't yet shaped by any species with the capacity to build or plan or leave intentional marks on the landscape. And from there, stories say they began to interact with it, not as conquerors arriving with loud declarations, but as travellers who slowly set roots down and began to adapt what they knew to what the planet offered. The idea of humanity having a connection to such beings grows from that point. If early Earth had simple life forms, and these visitors carried knowledge and genetic understanding beyond anything natural to the planet at the time, then the merging of those worlds becomes a central part of the story. Clay and breath, as old myths describe it, could simply be a metaphor for shaping something that already existed, not creating humans out of nothing, but guiding early hominins or hominin-like species into something more structured, more capable of memory, language, and the ability to pass down ideas. It's not difficult to see how this could become the foundation for later stories about gods forming mankind from earth and water. Myths usually shrink events over time, turning complex processes into symbols that can be told around fires or inscribed into tablets. As these imagined visitors lived among early humans, the exchange wouldn't have been one-sided. They might have brought knowledge of metals, basic astronomy, early forms of agriculture, or construction techniques. At the same time, they would have had to adapt to Earth the way migrants adapt to new climates, foods, or unfamiliar ecosystems. Nothing about their life here would have been effortless. They'd need materials, shelter, and long periods of adjustment. The meeting of those two worlds wouldn't be explosive or cinematic. It would be slow, shaped by necessity and the quiet survival tasks shared between beings who had to coexist. It's interesting to consider how long such a group might have stayed. If Nibiru's orbit truly stretched across great spans of time, then they might have known they wouldn't see their home again for thousands of years. Their stay on Earth could have been less of a visit and more of a complete relocation. Generations born here would have grown into people who saw Earth as their only home. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would eventually know nothing but the landscapes around them. The rivers that cut across the plains, the mountains that rose in the distance, and the sky that didn't move the way the old stories described. Over time, their memory of Nibiru would fade into ritual, poetry, or even structured religion, because that's how human communities preserve a distant place they can no longer reach. Those early groups would have blended with the people already evolving here, shaping a shared lineage that eventually spread across the world. Details would get lost, stories would bend into new shapes, and memories would drift until they became myths about gods descending from the heavens. Not in the sense of glowing beings arriving in flashes of light, but strangers from beyond this world who carried tools, knowledge, and ways of thinking that early humans couldn't explain in ordinary terms. As those stories travelled, they became the foundation for later civilizations, passed down from Sumer to Akkad, from Akkad to Babylon, and onward into cultures that adapted the names, titles, and symbols, but kept the core memory alive. If this path were real, the influence of those early visitors wouldn't show up only in myths. It would appear in patterns of early architecture, in sudden leaps in tool-making, in the emergence of social structures, and in the unexpected sophistication of the first cities. Archaeologists often marvel at how quickly some of those developments appeared in human history. It's not proof of anything extraordinary, but it opens the door to wondering how much influence came from outside forces rather than slow, isolated experimentation. If people with long lifespans or advanced knowledge lived among early humans, even for a few generations, the effects would ripple across tens of thousands of years. And as this imagined shared history unfolded, the connection to Nibiru would weaken but never disappear completely. It might surface in astronomical traditions, in symbols that point toward the sky, in origin myths that speak of arrival rather than emergence. It might echo in ideas about humans being shaped or designed rather than evolving through countless small steps. None of these ideas alone confirm anything definitive, but together they create a pattern that makes ancient people sound like they were remembering something instead of inventing everything from scratch. Eventually, if the story holds, the visitors would face a point where they had to decide whether to stay on Earth indefinitely or attempt to reconnect with the rhythm of their homeworld's orbit. If they left, it wouldn't erase the influence they had already woven into early civilization. Their absence would simply create a long, quiet space where humans had to continue on their own, carrying fragments of distant memories without fully understanding them, and those fragments would grow into legends about gods who once walked with people and then returned to the sky. This is where we'll continue next, easing into the idea of what humanity might look like if its roots reached not only into Earth's soil, but across the expanse of space toward a wandering world with a history intertwined with our own. When people imagine the earliest days of humanity, the picture usually begins on this planet. A warm plain somewhere near an ancient river, a cluster of simple shelters made of branches, the slow development of tools and language across thousands of generations. It's a comforting image, one that feels grounded and familiar because it ties us directly to the soil beneath our feet. But there's another story, a parallel path that suggests our roots may stretch far beyond these landscapes. And stepping into that possibility changes the way everything looks, not in a rushed or dramatic way, but in a slow shift of perspective, like turning your head just slightly to notice something you hadn't realized was there all along. If humanity had another home before Earth, the sky itself becomes a kind of inherited memory. Ancient people across cultures didn't just study the stars for navigation or rituals. They talked about them as if they were places tied to distant origins. They gave them names, stories, genealogies, and sometimes even described them as homelands. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the early Egyptians, all of them carried traces of a memory that didn't quite fit the limits of this world. And when old tablets mentioned beings who came from the sky, or descended from a wandering star, they weren't describing constellations in a poetic way. They were using the only language they had to express something that might have been remembered dimly from a time when the sky was more than a backdrop. To imagine humanity having another home means imagining a world that moved through the universe differently than Earth does. A world like Nibiru, described in old stories as a planet with an orbit so long and stretched that entire civilizations might rise and fall before it returned to the inner solar system. If such a place existed, and if beings from that world found their way here, the memory of their distant home wouldn't disappear instantly. It would linger in symbols carved into stone, in rituals repeated over centuries, in myths that held onto pieces of truth the way memories sometimes cling to scents or shapes rather than clear details. Not a direct recollection, but the vague imprint of something that shaped early human identity. Thinking of the sky as another home also helps explain why so many ancient cultures built structures aligned so meticulously with stars. They weren't just marking seasonal changes, they were tracking the heavens with a level of seriousness that feels almost personal. It's as though they were watching for something, waiting for a return, or honouring a connection older than the cities they built. If your ancestors came from a world that moved differently than Earth, then the sky would not only be a mysterious expanse, it would be a reminder, a connection, a place where the past lived just out of reach. Old stories describe the Anunnaki arriving not as sudden conquerors, but as travellers, people who came down to Earth during one of Nibiru's close passes. If that happened, the transition from their world to this one wouldn't have been smooth. They would have had memories of long days or long seasons, depending on how Nibiru rotated. They might have carried knowledge of constellations seen from another angle in space. They might have had internal rhythms shaped by a different cycle altogether. Their bodies would have adapted over generations to the gravity and air of Earth. But those early years might have felt disorienting, like migrants learning to live in a climate nothing like their homeland. Imagine a group stepping out from the edge of the sky and seeing Earth not as a foreign land, but as a place to settle, a place with potential for survival, a place where they could build something new. They might have chosen fertile plains, river valleys, or sheltered coastlines, not because they had advanced technology alone, but because even experienced travellers choose the same natural advantages early humans would later seek. Their early settlements might not have been grand or complex. They would have built what they needed with the materials available, learning the landscape one step at a time. Now think about how early humans on Earth would have reacted to meeting such travellers, not with myths or worship at first, but with curiosity. These beings would have spoken differently, acted differently, and carried tools or objects unfamiliar to the people who lived in those ancient landscapes. They might have worked metal long before local populations understood fire beyond its basic uses. They might have had knowledge of astronomy that allowed them to predict storms or seasons with a precision that seemed uncanny to those watching. Over time, those differences would shift into stories. A visitor who knew how to shape metal becomes a god of smithing. A traveller who could read the sky becomes a deity of stars or agriculture. Knowledge becomes myth because myths are easier to preserve across time than technical manuals. If Nibiru was once a home, the people who came from it wouldn't have abandoned all memory of it the moment they stepped onto Earth. They would have carried stories for their children, memories of a sky that moved in slow, colossal arcs, perhaps tales of a world with a reddish tint or long stretches of darkness. These memories might have softened as generations passed, eventually becoming stories of a heavenly realm or a faraway kingdom of the gods. Over time, the physical world they came from would become distant enough that it blended with imagination, until only fragments remained in symbols carved into stone or myths recited during rituals. The sky, once a real direction home, would slowly shift into a metaphor, and as those fragments scattered across Earth, different cultures picked up different pieces. Some spoke of celestial wanderers, some described gods who came down to teach, rule, or shape early humans. Others told stories of star relatives, beings who mated with people or gave them knowledge that couldn't have been developed naturally at the time. These stories appear not just in one region, but across continents separated by oceans. When you look at them side by side, the similarities are difficult to ignore. It's as if people everywhere were trying to remember something they had once been told, even if the details had changed through time and distance. If the sky had been another home, the relationship between Earth and Nibiru would not have been simply scientific. It would have been emotional in ways that humans understand deeply. Migrants always carry emotional ties to the places they leave behind. Even after generations, they pass down traditions, songs, foods, habits, and a sense of connection to lands their children may never see. If the Anunnaki truly lived here long enough to blend with early humans, then their descendants might have inherited not only genetic traits but also subtle feelings of longing toward the sky, a sense of origin that doesn't quite feel grounded in Earth alone. It's possible that this deeply rooted impulse to look upward, to wonder, to search for meaning in the stars is not entirely symbolic. It could be a faint echo of an ancient identity carried over thousands of years. Thinking about the sky as another home also adds context to the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in early civilizations. The leap from simple hunter-gatherer groups to complex societies with writing, mathematics, irrigation systems, and monumental architecture happened faster than a slow evolutionary timeline would predict. It doesn't mean those achievements were impossible for humans alone, but the speed raises interesting possibilities. If groups with knowledge from another world lived among early humans, even temporarily, the exchange of information would not need to be dramatic or overt. A few generations of shared ideas would have shaped the foundations of what became Sumer, Egypt, and later civilizations across the world. Those early people weren't passive recipients of knowledge. They would have adapted it, experimented with it, and expanded it into their own systems. The result is not a story of being taught by gods, but a collaboration that left subtle traces in the earliest records, traces that don't quite match the slow, linear progression usually expected in human development, traces that look like someone suddenly introduced new concepts and then stepped back as humans figured out the rest. If the sky had been our first home, then the oldest stories of humanity aren't just metaphors about divine beings. They are memories told in the only language people of that time had access to. A world beyond Earth becomes heaven. Visitors become gods. Knowledge becomes magic. Everyday actions of advanced beings become legends. And as centuries pass, the details soften until the stories become part of the cultural fabric of entire regions. What makes this idea compelling isn't that it replaces science. It's that it weaves itself around gaps and curiosities that science hasn't fully answered. Why do so many ancient cultures describe the same kinds of beings arriving from the sky? Why did early civilizations appear so suddenly and fully developed? Why do origin myths across the world echo one another despite oceans separating the storytellers? Why did people assume the sky was a home rather than just a direction? None of these questions prove anything on their own, but when you place them side by side, they paint a picture of a world where humanity might have inherited more than it appears. A world where Earth is a second home, shaped over thousands of years by people who once lived somewhere else entirely. And if that history left its mark on our earliest cultures, then we are still feeling its effects now in ways we don't always recognize. People often talk about having wanderlust, a pull toward distant places, the feeling that they were meant to be somewhere else. Others describe an unexplainable fascination with the stars, or a deep comfort when looking into the night sky. It could be imagination, nostalgia, or simply curiosity. Or it could be something older. A quiet memory passed forward through generations, not in words but in sensations. A subtle imprint left by ancestors who once looked at a completely different sky, on a completely different world, thinking of the place we now call home. And if humanity truly had another home in the sky, then the stories that followed, about migrations, interactions, and the formation of early civilizations would unfold with new meaning as we drift into the next part of this story, letting the connection between Earth and that wandering world continue to take shape. The idea of humanity taking its first steps beyond Earth usually brings to mind images of rockets, astronauts, or the slow crawl of modern space exploration. But if the story suggested by ancient myths holds even a thread of truth, our real first steps might not have been outward at all. They might have been backward, reaching into a time when beings who would later blend with humans began their journey not from this world, but toward it. Those earliest footsteps would have come not from laboratories or launch pads, but from a distant world moving along a long, sweeping path through the darkness. And thinking about that possibility changes everything about how we imagine where we came from and how our earliest ancestors understood themselves. If Nibiru was truly a wandering world with a stretched, elongated orbit far beyond the familiar planets, then life there would have developed under conditions completely unlike Earth's. A planet spending most of its time far from the sun would face cold stretches that lasted for centuries, perhaps even millennia. Yet when it passed through the inner solar system, it would experience shorter periods of warmth and light. A species growing up in those circumstances would learn to survive both extremes. They would need to be adaptable, resourceful, and capable of planning across time spans that make human generations seem brief by comparison. Their society might have evolved slowly, with long cycles of hardship followed by periods of expansion, when conditions allowed communities to flourish. Those traits, adaptability, patience, the ability to think in long arcs, would shape how they approach survival. If their world became unstable, or if resources dwindled, they would know from experience that waiting for another orbit might not be enough. They would have already learned to travel, build, and preserve knowledge across vast periods. They would approach mobility as a necessity rather than a dream. And eventually, after countless cycles, they might look outward for new places to settle, not as conquerors searching for new territories, but as survivors seeking stability after centuries of changing conditions. Picture their early attempts at leaving their world. Not sleek ships or towering structures. More likely, their first steps would echo the way humans once used simple rafts to explore coastlines before building deep ocean vessels. They might have developed basic forms of travel, designed to lift them off the surface and into the thinner parts of their atmosphere. Small steps at first, gradual improvements across many generations, each invention building on the lessons of the one before it. A single breakthrough might take decades or centuries, but time would work differently for them. Long-term thinking would be woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Eventually, those early attempts would grow into something more ambitious. The people who created the myths later passed down as Anunnaki would not have reached Earth instantly or effortlessly. The first to leave Nibiru might not have aimed directly for another planet. They might have built stations or waypoints in the cold stretches of their orbit, places where they could gather resources or maintain equipment between long journeys. They would have experimented with different ways of storing energy, creating shelter in the vacuum, or navigating by using gravitational forces. Progress would have been steady, shaped by necessity and experience rather than visions of conquest. Over time, these scattered attempts would have formed a network of knowledge. They would have learned how to use the movement of celestial bodies to their advantage. They might have discovered the gravitational pull of other planets and moons, using those forces as natural corridors to shorten long journeys. That understanding would grow until travel between worlds became possible, even if it was slow, dangerous, and required planning across many generations. The earliest explorers might have set out knowing they would never return to Nibiru. Their descendants would continue the journey, carrying with them stories of a home they had never seen except maybe in the way elders described a sky of long seasons and a sun that seemed far away. As their technology improved, the idea of reaching a new world would shift from a distant hope into a practical goal. They would scan the skies looking for signs of warmth, atmosphere, and water. Earth would not have been the only candidate, but its position near the sun, its blue oceans, and its stable climate would have made it appealing. They might have observed Earth long before they attempted to land here, watching it from afar through instruments that tracked weather patterns, geological features, and the presence of early life. Their first impressions might have been cautious. The atmosphere would be different, the temperature warmer, and the gravity either slightly uncomfortable or surprisingly manageable depending on their own world's conditions. The first explorers stepping onto Earth would not have arrived with loud engines or flashing lights. Their landing might have gone unnoticed by the early life forms occupying the planet. Even if humans were not yet present, the world would have been filled with other species adapting to their environments. The travellers from Nibiru would have had to observe quietly, taking time to learn how local ecosystems worked. They would study the planet's cycles of day and night, the rhythm of seasons, the behaviour of animals, and the growth patterns of plants. They would test water sources, build temporary shelters, and search for places where they could build more permanent structures without disturbing the developing life already here. Imagine standing in their place for a moment. You step away from a vessel that carried you across a distance so large that your mind may never fully process it. You're surrounded by air that smells unfamiliar. You hear sounds made by creatures you've never seen. The light feels different on your skin. The ground beneath your feet has a softness or firmness unlike your homeworld. You look at the sky and see a sun that's brighter and larger than the one you grew up under, and stars that appear in different patterns at night. Nothing is familiar, yet everything presents an opportunity. You have the chance to build something new, something that could last long after you're gone. Those first explorers would have likely chosen to settle in areas with fresh water sources, moderate temperatures, and rich landscapes. Valleys, riverbanks, and coastal regions would have been attractive. They might also have sought out places where they could easily access minerals, stone, or other natural resources needed to build shelters or tools. Their early structures would not have been monumental or designed to last thousands of years. They would be functional, built quickly, and made to withstand unfamiliar weather conditions. Over time, as they adapted and learned more about Earth's environment, their architecture would evolve into forms more suited to long-term survival. It's possible that some groups returned to Nibiru or journeyed between the two worlds during favourable periods of the orbit. Others may have stayed behind permanently, establishing the first communities that blended technologies from their home with what the New World offered. Those communities would have grown slowly at first, then expanded as they became more comfortable with Earth. In time, they would no longer feel like temporary settlers. They would become people of this planet, even if they carried memories, stories, or symbols that reminded them of the world they came from. If humans truly descended from a merging of Earth's early inhabitants and the travellers who came from Nibiru, then the first steps of those travellers mark the turning point in the story of our species. Not a dramatic arrival, but the beginning of a quiet integration. Early humans already developing here would have been curious about the newcomers. They might have observed them from a distance before approaching. Over time, they would learn from them, share resources, or exchange simple tools. The Nibirans might have introduced techniques that accelerated human development, such as innovations in fire, harvesting, or basic shelter building. This exchange would have grown incrementally until the two groups blended, not through force or domination, but through necessity and shared understanding. The travellers needed help navigating the wildlife, weather, and unfamiliar rhythms of this planet, while the early humans benefited from knowledge that helped them survive more efficiently. Neither group would have understood the other perfectly at first. Communication would have required patience, gestures, and slowly learned sounds. But humans are adaptable and observational by nature, and the travellers from Nibiru, shaped by long cycles and careful planning, would have understood the value of establishing peaceful relationships. As generations passed, the newcomers would have had children born entirely on Earth. These children might have inherited physical traits from both lineages, blending biological differences until the two groups became one population. Their descendants would have grown up hearing stories of a sky that once looked different, of a world far away with seasons that stretched over lifetimes, and of ancestors who crossed the darkness between worlds. Those stories would eventually lose their literal context and become myths about gods descending from the heavens to guide humanity. The first footsteps beyond Earth, in this version of our history, were not human at all. They were made by ancestors whose world moved far beyond the familiar planets, ancestors who chose Earth not just as a temporary stop, but as the place where their lineage would merge with another and take root. And while the details of that merging may have softened through time, traces of it remain in the earliest records of civilization, in the myths that describe creators arriving from above, and in the universal human habit of looking toward the sky, as if searching for something remembered faintly. What began with quiet footsteps on a new world would eventually grow into the beginnings of civilization, and the gradual unfolding of knowledge that seemed to arrive faster than chance alone should allow, carrying us into the next part of this story, where the long path of a wandering planet intertwines with the earliest dawns of humanity on Earth. When people first hear the idea of a wandering world brushing past our own, it often sounds like something that should belong in a distant corner of imagination, somewhere between myth and forgotten astronomy. But if Nibiru existed as ancient stories describe it, moving along a stretched and looping path around the sun, then there may have been a time when its distant arc brought it close enough to Earth to leave a mark far deeper than a passing light in the sky. A world doesn't need to collide or come dangerously close to reshape the history of another. Sometimes all it takes is proximity, gravitational influence, or the presence of travellers who timed their journey to match the moment when two planets drifted near each other for a brief window in the long story of the solar system. To imagine that crossing, the first thing to understand is the scale of time involved. If Nibiru's orbit truly stretched across thousands or tens of thousands of years, then one pass near Earth would not be a frequent event by human standards. Civilizations would rise and fall between such crossings, landscapes would change, climates would shift, species would appear and disappear. But for the inhabitants of a world shaped by long cycles, those intervals might feel more like seasons. Their histories would not be measured in decades or even centuries, but in slow arcs across the sky, When they saw their planet drifting back toward the inner solar system, it wouldn't simply be an astronomical occurrence. It would be an opportunity their ancestors had prepared for, the same way people prepare for migrations or harvests. As Nibiru approached the region of space where Earth orbits, the people living on it would have watched from afar. They would have studied our world long before attempting any contact. If they had observed Earth during previous crossings, they might have carried stories or records describing what it looked like thousands of years earlier. Perhaps their astronomers had traced Earth's development from afar, noting changes in its atmosphere or surface. They might have observed early signs of life growing more complex during earlier passages, watching the planet's evolution the way humans today observe distant exoplanets. Each return would give them a clearer picture, more detail, and more reasons to consider Earth as a stable place where their descendants could eventually settle. The actual crossing between the two worlds would have been a long event, not something that happened in a single night or through sudden contact. These movements unfold over years. The sunlight reflecting off Nibiru might have become visible to keen eyes among early humans, perhaps misunderstood as a bright star or unusual celestial body. Ancient people often recorded unusual lights, comets, or wandering objects in the sky with reverence or caution. If one such light grew steadily brighter across generations, appearing in the same season or rising in the same position, it could easily have been the basis for a myth that later solidified into legend. No one would have had the technical language to describe an incoming planet, but they would have understood the importance of something unfamiliar entering their sky. For the travellers of Nibiru, the moment of closest approach would be the culmination of centuries of preparation. They would have planned expeditions with careful timing, ensuring they had enough time to leave their world, travel the distance and settle temporarily on a planet with an environment far different from their own. They would have studied the gravitational relationships between the two planets, calculating trajectories that would allow them to conserve energy and avoid dangerous paths. Their crossing would not be sudden or reckless. It would be a quiet, calculated migration carried out by people who'd done this before, or whose ancestors had prepared them for this possibility. When the two worlds drifted closest, the distance between them would still have been enormous by everyday standards, but close enough that navigation became feasible. Space, after all, is vast, but even vast journeys become possible with enough time, knowledge, and the ability to think beyond the scope of a single lifetime. The travellers who left Nibiru during that crossing would have done so knowing they might never return. They would carry with them the food, tools, and knowledge needed to build a life on a world that did not share their long cycles or deep, cold seasons. They would bring with them seeds, metals, simple machinery, and most importantly, an understanding of how to create systems that could sustain life wherever they landed. The idea of a wandering world touching our own does not require physical collision. Gravitational effects alone can reshape climates or alter orbits subtly over long periods. Some researchers have wondered whether periodic disruptions in Earth's history, such as unusual climate swings or unexpected bursts of geological activity, could be linked to external cosmic influences. Though these discussions remain theoretical, they offer a way to imagine how Earth might have responded when another large body moved closer to its path. But beyond physical changes, the more dramatic shift would have come from the arrival of beings who stepped off their vessels and walked into the ancient landscapes of Earth. Early humans living at the time of such a crossing would not have known what they were witnessing. The appearance of travellers would have been unlike anything in their experience. They might have approached cautiously, watching from a distance before daring to interact. The first interactions between the two groups would likely have been simple exchanges of gestures, sounds, or objects. The travellers would need to communicate in the only ways available before any shared language could form. They might have demonstrated tools, drawn symbols in the dirt, or shown early humans how to perform basic tasks more efficiently. The earliest moments would not resemble the dramatic scenes found in modern stories. They would be quiet, hesitant, shaped by mutual observation and curiosity. Over time, as trust grew between the two groups, the travellers from Nibiru might have begun to share more substantial knowledge. They would not have overwhelmed early humans with complex information. Instead, they would offer what was immediately useful: how to shape a piece of metal into a tool, how to store food for long periods, how to predict seasons by watching the sky. These small exchanges would ripple outward over generations, becoming the seeds of early civilization. The crossing of the two worlds would thus mark a turning point when Earth's early inhabitants began to advance at a pace far faster than natural development alone would predict. For the travellers, Earth would not be a simple destination. It would be a place they needed to adapt to. The gravity would feel different. The air might taste sharper or heavier. The plants and animals would be unfamiliar. Learning how to live here would require observation and caution, just as early humans learned how to navigate their environment. The merging of these two groups would not be one-sided. The travellers would also learn from the humans who had already lived on Earth for countless generations. They would learn which plants were safe, which animals posed danger, and which regions offered the best shelter. The two groups would gradually blend their knowledge, creating a shared understanding that neither could have developed alone. As this blending continued, the idea of Nibiru would slowly shift from a physical home into a cultural memory. The descendants of the travellers would grow up hearing stories of a world with long winters and long summers, of a sky that moved slowly across the heavens, of a sun that seemed smaller or less warm than Earth's. But these stories would lose clarity as generations passed. They would be told by people who had never seen that world, filtered through the experiences of living on Earth. Eventually, Nibiru would become less a place and more a symbol. The sky would transform from a literal direction home into a source of origin myths. Ancient civilizations did not view the heavens as an empty region filled with distant stars. They saw it as a realm occupied by ancestors, gods, or beings who once descended to shape the world. The idea that some of those beings were travellers from a distant planet fits into this worldview far more naturally than it does into modern interpretations. The myths describing sky gods who taught humanity, who brought law or agriculture or writing, who came down in times of great importance, could all be reframed as memories of those first interactions during the crossing between the two worlds. The crossing itself would have lasted for years, perhaps decades. Nibiru's slow movement would allow enough time for travel, settlement, and the establishment of communities on Earth. When the planet began to move away again, some of the travellers might have returned. Others, especially those with children born here, would have stayed, their lives now rooted in Earth's soil. Over time, their technology might degrade without the infrastructure of their home world. Tools would break, materials would run out, knowledge that required complex equipment would fade. The descendants of both groups would rely more on local resources and less on remnants from Nibiru. This gradual loss of advanced knowledge would give rise to myths describing a time when the gods withdrew or when humanity lost the secrets it once possessed. Earth's early civilizations emerged shortly after such a theoretical crossing would have taken place. The appearance of agriculture, writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture occurred with surprising suddenness in human history. These developments may have been accelerated by the blending of knowledge from two different worlds, not because humans were incapable of doing these things alone, but because the spark provided by the travellers offered a path forward that would have taken much longer to develop otherwise. The crossing, then, becomes more than a physical event. It becomes the foundation of human civilization. As Nibiru moved away, the memory of its last passage would linger for a while, but after several generations the sky would return to its usual patterns. The unfamiliar light that once appeared might fade. The world would settle back into a familiar rhythm. Only the stories would remain, slowly changing shape with each retelling. What began as a factual account of a distant world touching Earth would eventually turn into myth, carved into stone tablets as the deeds of gods or written into scripts that described celestial visitors in metaphors that hid their true identities. And even as the direct memory faded, humanity would continue looking toward the sky, perhaps without knowing why. The pull of the stars may not be rooted only in curiosity. It could be the faint echo of a time when our ancestors watched the heavens, not for beauty, but for signs of a world they once called home. A world that passed close enough to touch our own before drifting back into the cold distances of its long orbit, leaving its descendants behind on a planet that would become the cradle of a new beginning. The crossing between the two worlds would not be the end of the story, of course. It would only set the stage for everything that followed as the people of Earth and the travellers from Nibiru moved deeper into a shared future, shaping the landscapes, cultures, and early civilizations that would eventually carry their blended legacy into the ages that came after. If you picture the earliest moments when the travellers from Nibiru finally stepped onto Earth, it's tempting to imagine something bright and dramatic, the kind of scene that would fill a painting or a storybook. But if the old memories hidden inside ancient myths contain even the smallest kernel of truth, the reality was likely quieter. It might have been early morning, with soft light spreading across a landscape untouched by cities or tools. The shapes of mountains in the distance, rivers bending through the plains, forests breathing mist into the sky. Into that morning, into that stillness, the first of them arrived. They would not have descended with noise or spectacle. Travel across the distances between worlds would have required efficiency, caution, and the careful use of energy. If their vessels were designed for long voyages through cold space, they wouldn't have created the kind of thunderous displays that modern imaginations tend to add. Their landing could have been subtle enough that early humans or hominin groups nearby might have mistaken it for something natural, a flash of light on the horizon or a strange glimmer passing overhead. Only those who were close enough would have seen figures stepping out into the gentle light of dawn, moving slowly, adjusting to an atmosphere that felt different in every breath. The early morning hours would have been the safest time for them. Temperatures were cooler, the light was soft. Animals were awake but not yet active enough to pose danger. The travellers could have taken their first steps without being overwhelmed by heat or by the brightness of a sun much stronger than the one they knew. They might have paused at the edge of the vessel, letting their eyes adjust, feeling the weight of gravity pulling down in a way that required instinctive compensation. These small moments, unremarkable by themselves, would become the first traces of a story passed down through thousands of years. If the people who descended that day were explorers, they would have been trained for this. If they were emigrants seeking refuge or a new home, they might have carried a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Either way, they would have moved carefully, aware that every step could bring something new. Their clothing, tools, and physical forms might have looked different to early humans, but not so different as to be entirely unrecognizable as people. Many ancient myths describe the visitors from the sky as tall, strong, or radiant, but these descriptions likely formed later, shaped by storytellers trying to explain beings who were simply unfamiliar. The travellers might have looked extraordinary only because the people watching had no frame of reference for someone who came from another world. Imagine the early humans who first saw them. They might have been gathering food, following an animal trail, or simply waking in their shelters when they noticed shapes moving across the open plain. Perhaps they watched from a distance at first, unsure whether these newcomers were friend or threat. Curiosity would draw them closer, fear would hold them back. The travellers, aware of being observed, might have paused and lifted their hands in a gesture meant to signal peace. This simple act, repeated in countless encounters throughout human history, could have been the first moment of recognition between the two groups. The dawn light would reveal details slowly. The travellers' clothing, likely made from materials unfamiliar on Earth. The design of their tools, shaped for both survival and exploration. The way they moved, cautious but confident. And the way they examined their surroundings with a sense of purpose, noting plants, soil, and the shapes of the land. Early humans watching them would have sensed intelligence, intention, and something that set them apart from anything else alive on Earth. Once the first contact was made, both groups would begin learning from each other in ways that didn't require a shared language. Humans are incredibly observant. They watch gestures, facial expressions, posture, and tone. The travellers would do the same. Over time, the two groups might have approached each other gradually, offering objects or food to show goodwill. An early human might place a fruit on the ground, then step back. A traveller might place a tool or a shaped piece of metal in return. It would be a simple exchange, but it would mark the beginning of a relationship that would shape the future of both species. The dawn light of that first meeting might have held an unusual sense of calm. The travellers, adjusting to new gravity and air, would have taken slow, steady breaths. The humans, instinctively reading body language, would pick up on their intentions. It's not difficult to imagine that some of the earliest myths of gods descending from the heavens were based on these first encounters. But in those moments, neither side would have thought in such terms. They were simply people trying to understand one another. As the sun climbed higher, the travellers would begin setting up a temporary camp. They would need shade, a place to rest, and a way to analyse the environment. Early humans might circle at a distance, watching as structures took form, simple frameworks that didn't resemble local huts or shelters. The travellers might use metals or fabrics unknown to the humans. They might assemble objects that hummed softly or glowed faintly, not because they were magical, but because they came from a world where different materials were used routinely. These details would stay in the memories of the humans who witnessed them, eventually turning into stories about tools that shone like stars or objects that carried the light of the heavens. It would not take long for early humans to approach more confidently. They had survived predators far more aggressive than these cautious newcomers. Over time, one person might step forward, perhaps a brave youth or a mother carrying a child. Humans are drawn to connection, especially when curiosity outweighs fear. The travellers, aware of the need to establish peaceful relations, might have offered water or food. Something simple, something that showed they understood the basics of survival. That offering, placed gently in an outstretched hand, could have been remembered for thousands of years in stories describing how the gods gave nourishment to the first people. Communication would grow slowly, built on gestures first, then sounds. Both sides would try to mimic each other's words. Laughter might break tension when an attempt went wrong. These small details, the kind of things that rarely make it into myths, would have defined the early days of their relationship. The travellers would need to learn Earth's sounds and scents, Earth's animals and weather, Earth's water sources and plants. The humans would learn new ways of thinking, new ways of shaping materials, new ways of observing the world. The travellers would have explained nothing in complex terms. There was no reason to overwhelm early humans with intricate cosmology or physics. Instead, they would demonstrate. They might show how to grind certain stones to make sharper blades, how to tie structures so they withstand storms, how to move heavy objects using simple techniques that humans had not yet discovered. These demonstrations, carried out in the dawnlight and throughout the days that followed, would become the foundations of what later generations called teachings from the gods. Not because the travellers were divine, but because their knowledge came from a place beyond anything Earth had known. One of the most profound moments might have been when the travellers first looked upward with the humans beside them. They would point to the sky, perhaps to the region where their world would eventually become visible again. They might draw in the dirt to explain their home's long movement around the sun. Early humans, trying to grasp the idea, would see only symbols or shapes. But the memory of that gesture, the idea that someone pointed to the sky and said, "We came from there," would echo through generations, eventually becoming the origin myths told by priests, scribes, and astrologers in the earlier cities. When night arrived, the humans would show the travellers their own understanding of the sky. They would point to constellations, stars used for navigation, the rising and setting of the moon. The travellers might recognise some patterns from afar, but others would appear unfamiliar because they had always viewed these stars from a different angle. This moment of shared stargazing would bridge the distance between the two groups, not through words, but through the shared human instinct to look upward and wonder. As days turned into weeks, the travellers would integrate slowly with local groups, They would learn Earth's rhythms, rainfall cycles, the habits of predators, the changing of seasons. Early humans would learn in return how to craft certain tools more efficiently, how to observe the sky for subtle shifts, how to organize their shelters in practical ways that improved survival. None of this would feel sudden or miraculous. It would feel natural, the way two cultures learn from each other when they meet for the first time. The travellers might have had children during these early years. These children, born on Earth, would represent a merging of lineages. They would grow up playing in the forests and fields of this planet, speaking languages shaped by both groups. As they matured, they would embody the connection between two worlds, carrying traits, knowledge, and instincts that blended both origins. Later generations would elevate these early children into legends, describing them as demigods or heroes, not because they were supernatural, but because their ancestry was unlike anything known at the time. The travellers' camp would eventually grow into a more permanent settlement. Structures would rise from the ground, perhaps made of clay, stone, or wood, adapted from local materials combined with techniques brought from afar. Early humans would help with construction, learning how to create sturdier buildings and more complex layouts. These settlements might have been the prototypes for early villages that later grew into cities. Their influence could be seen in architectural styles that appear suddenly advanced, in alignments with stars, or in symbols carved into stone that resemble celestial patterns. Over time, the dawn-light arrival would fade from memory, softened into stories told around fires. The travellers themselves might have lived long lives, longer than humans of that era. Their descendants would carry hints of those traits, giving rise to myths of beings with long lifespans who walked among people. But eventually the original travellers would die. Their tools would break. Their knowledge, unless passed down carefully, would begin to fade. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would identify more with Earth than with Nibiru. The final link to the wandering world would become symbolic rather than literal. What remained was the memory of those who descended quietly one morning, long before humanity understood the sky in scientific terms. The stories of visitors from the heavens would spread across regions, each culture shaping them differently. Some would call them gods, some would call them angels, some would call them teachers, some would call them ancestors. But beneath each variation is a steady thread. Someone came from above, someone taught, someone guided, someone walked among the first people and helped them become something more. And as that memory spread, it would lead directly into the next part of the story, where the merging of these two worlds began to reshape early humans into the beings who would eventually build the first true civilizations on Earth. When ancient stories describe the making of humanity, they often use simple images that feel familiar even to modern ears. A figure kneeling in the dust, shaping something from clay. A breath whispered across a still surface. A quiet moment when a lifeless form stirs and becomes something new. These images appear in cultures far apart from one another, preserved in scriptures, carved into stone tablets, repeated in creation stories passed down for thousands of years. The details vary, but the pattern remains. Something was shaped from the earth. Something was given breath. Something was designed with purpose rather than left to chance. And if the old myths reflect memories rather than metaphors, those images might echo a time when early humanity was not just a product of natural development, but a combination of two worlds merging into a single lineage. The early humans who lived on Earth when the travellers from Nibiru arrived were not blank slates. They had already survived harsh climates, predators, storms, and long migrations. They had developed communities, tools, and social structures that helped them thrive, but there were limits to what they could achieve with the knowledge they possessed at the time. Their physical traits were suited to survival, but their ability to create written records, complex architecture, agriculture, or organised societies was still developing. This is where the travellers' influence may have shaped the blueprint of what humans would become, not through magic or sudden transformation, but through careful and intentional blending of knowledge, biology, and time. The idea that humanity was shaped from clay appears again and again in the earliest civilizations. Clay, in ancient terms, simply meant the raw material of life, the substance of the earth itself. Early humans understood that their existence depended on the ground beneath them. Clay was what they used to build homes, store food, and create symbols of their identity. When storytellers describe the first humans being moulded from clay, they weren't speaking literally. They were saying that life was shaped from the environment, then given something more, something that came from beyond the limits of the planet. If the travellers studied early humans closely, they might have recognised both potential and limitation. They would see beings capable of empathy, cooperation, and learning. They would also see physical fragility, short lifespans, and a lack of structured knowledge. Their decision to intervene might have come from a mixture of necessity and practical wisdom. If they planned to live on Earth for generations, they would need a species that could share the workload, maintain settlements, and eventually build independent societies. That process would not be a single action. It would unfold gradually, taking many generations as travellers mixed with humans, blending traits until their descendants carried a balanced combination of resilience and intelligence. The earliest changes would not have been visible. They would live inside the body, in the slow shaping of neural development, in the way the brain processed language or memory, in the strength of hands, or the endurance of the body. These kinds of adjustments would take time. The travellers might have guided them subtly, teaching early humans how to use fire more effectively, how to build more durable shelters, how to shape tools that could break ground or cut wood with efficiency. Each new skill would alter the way humans lived, forming the foundation for future development. The breath mentioned in ancient myths, the divine breath, the breath of life, could reflect the introduction of new traits or knowledge passed directly from one species to another. Breath represents communication, instruction, and shared understanding. The travellers would have taught early humans through spoken language, gestures, and demonstrations. Each lesson could be remembered, expanded, and passed down through families. The breath, in this sense, becomes the spark that shifted humanity from simple survival into deliberate creation. The blueprint of a species is not just physical. It includes the ways minds develop, how people solve problems, how memories form, and how long they can plan ahead. If the travellers influenced early humans, they may have encouraged behaviours that supported long-term thinking, planting seeds that would bear fruit months later, storing food for winter, observing star patterns to predict seasons. These habits would reshape the rhythms of daily life, moving humanity from reactive survival towards structured planning. Over time, this change in thinking would support the emergence of agriculture, settlements, and eventually the first cities. To picture how this blueprint might have taken shape, imagine a traveller sitting beside an early human at the edge of a river, showing them how to form clay into a bowl. The traveller shapes the clay slowly, pressing gently, smoothing the edges. The human watches closely, mimicking each movement. At first, the bowl collapses or cracks, but with practice, the human learns the feel of it. This simple skill, once learned, allows a community to store grain, carry water, or protect food from animals. It becomes the seed of pottery, an innovation that humans later refine into one of the most important technologies in history. In another moment, a traveller might draw symbols in the dirt to record information. The human beside them observes, trying to understand why the shapes matter. The traveller points at the sky, then at the symbols, connecting them in a way that suggests mapping or tracking time. Early humans would not have grasped the entire concept immediately, but they would remember the shapes. Over time, the symbols become the beginnings of writing systems. Even if the original meaning fades, the idea that information can be recorded outside the mind becomes part of humanity's emerging identity. The process of merging two species also includes emotional development. Early humans already experienced love, fear, curiosity, and grief. But the travellers might have introduced new ways of expressing those emotions through rituals, songs, or structured community gatherings. These practices would help groups stay cohesive, easing conflicts, and allowing larger communities to form without falling apart. The blueprint of humanity is shaped as much by emotional intelligence as by physical traits or intellectual capacity. As the generations passed, the line between traveller and human would blur. Descendants would carry characteristics from both worlds. They might have sharper vision, stronger hands, or more endurance. Their minds might form memories more clearly or process information with greater complexity. They might learn languages more quickly, retain knowledge longer, or create tools with a level of precision unseen in earlier times. These changes would not appear overnight, but century by century, line by line, humanity would become something new. In time, the travellers would no longer be a distinct group. Their children and grandchildren would grow up among humans, forming the earliest mixed communities. These communities would share stories about the ancestors who came from the sky, stories that eventually turned into legends about gods or creators, not because the travellers demanded worship, but because later generations, unable to fully understand their origin, used myth to fill the gaps. The blueprint of a species also includes the ability to question. Humans began to ask where they came from, why they existed, and what purpose their lives served. These questions appear in the oldest texts and oral traditions not because early humans had abundant leisure time to ponder them, but because they were part of a species that had suddenly begun looking beyond immediate needs. They had the cognitive capacity to explore meaning, morality, and the structure of the world. This kind of introspection might have been encouraged by travellers who had lived for centuries, passing down wisdom about resilience, cooperation, or foresight. Some ancient stories describe the creators shaping humanity in stages, adjusting their form until they achieved a balanced design. These stories could reflect the slow refinement of traits across generations. Early attempts might have produced offspring who were less adaptable or who struggled to survive. Later generations would carry stronger combinations of traits, leading to more stable communities and more consistent development. The blueprint would stabilize as more and more children were born who could thrive in Earth's environment. Eventually the travellers might have stepped back, letting humans walk their own path. They would watch as communities developed traditions, languages, and cultural identities rooted in their merged origin. They would encourage leadership, craftsmanship, and shared responsibility. Over time, humans would no longer need direct guidance. They would begin to innovate on their own, shaping their world with knowledge inherited from two separate lineages. The idea that humanity was shaped from clay and given breath takes on new meaning in this light. Clay represents earth, the physical environment. Breath represents knowledge, intention, and the spark that transforms potential into action. The blueprint represents the long-term vision of what humanity could become: creative, resilient, intelligent, and capable of building civilizations that stretch far beyond simple survival. As these early developments took hold, humans began building structures that aligned with the sky, tracking celestial bodies with a precision that still puzzles researchers today. They created myths that describe their origins in ways that echo what might have truly happened, filtered through generations of storytelling. They developed writing systems, agricultural techniques, and architectural methods that appeared suddenly rather than gradually. These changes, often treated as rapid breakthroughs in archaeology, could be the echo of that long period when travellers walked among humans, blending their knowledge into the core of a new species. The blueprint of humanity was not simply written in physical traits. It was woven into the way humans tell stories, build communities, and seek meaning. It appears in the instinct to explore, to create, to understand the world, and to look toward the sky with a sense of familiarity rather than fear. These instincts may not be random. They may be the inherited memories of ancestors who came from a wandering world, who shaped humanity not through divine power, but through patience, teaching, and long-term vision. And as humanity took its first steps into becoming something more than a collection of isolated groups, the influence of the travellers would continue to guide their development, leading directly into the next part of the story, where the merging of these origins begins to shape the earliest civilizations and the shared destiny of two worlds intertwining across time. When people look back at the earliest myths describing the Anunnaki, they often focus on the dramatic details: tall beings, shimmering tools, long lifespans, and knowledge that seem to appear out of nowhere. But buried beneath all of those stories is a quieter thread, something far more practical, almost mundane in its necessity. It is the idea that the visitors from Nibiru didn't come to Earth by accident or out of idle curiosity. They came because they needed something essential, something their homeworld either lacked or could no longer produce in the quantities required to sustain their way of life. The stories call it gold. Gold has a certain weight in human imagination today. Its colour, its softness, the way it catches light, its role in economies, jewellery and status. It carries associations of wealth, beauty and power. But in the earliest myths, gold was not described as a symbol of luxury. It was a material with purpose, a substance that solved specific problems, a resource so important that its absence could threaten the stability of a world. And if the Anunnaki truly travelled across vast distances, leaving behind the world of their origins to settle on Earth for generations, then gold must have held a meaning far deeper than adornment. The idea often repeated in ancient stories is that Nibiru suffered a crisis, a gradual decline in the stability of its atmosphere. If the planet truly had a long-stretched orbit, the temperatures and radiation it experienced would shift dramatically, depending on how close or far it was from the sun. During its long winters, the air might thin or cool to dangerous levels. During its brief warm seasons, the environment would stabilise again, but perhaps not enough to maintain long-term livable conditions. This imbalance could grow worse over thousands of years, creating a pattern of environmental decline that forced the inhabitants to search for solutions. Their solution, according to the oldest accounts, involved gold. Not for currency, but for atmospheric engineering. Fine particles suspended in the upper layers of a planet's atmosphere can reflect or scatter radiation, regulate temperature, and help maintain proper pressure. It's not unlike concepts that modern scientists have proposed to slow climate change: thin layers of reflective material, aerosols or engineered compounds that could help control heat. The travellers from Nibiru, with a far longer history of dealing with extreme environmental cycles, might have developed a sophisticated system using gold, a metal resistant to corrosion, easy to work with, and highly stable. If their world entered a period of atmospheric instability severe enough to threaten their survival, they would eventually exhaust their local supplies of gold. Or perhaps the deposits left on Nibiru were difficult to access due to geological shifts. Whatever the reason, gold became a resource that could no longer be produced at home. Their civilization, built over thousands of years, depended on a consistent supply. Without it, the systems that regulated their environment would begin to fail. If those systems were deeply intertwined with daily life, climate control, energy production, structural integrity, then the need for gold would be urgent and constant. This necessity would drive exploration outward, not as a grand heroic mission, but as a survival strategy. They would search for worlds with enough gold to sustain their systems. Earth, with its rich mineral deposits, would become a prime candidate. Over millions of years of geological activity, mountain ranges formed, continents drifted, and rivers exposed veins of gold. The metal concentrated in places where water carved through rock, or where volcanic activity brought dense materials to the surface. For the travellers scanning distant worlds, Earth would appear as a treasure of resources they desperately needed. When they arrived, their first priority would not be teaching humanity or shaping civilizations. It would be survival. They would need gold, and they would need it in quantities that no small group could extract alone. Mining by hand would be slow and dangerous. They would need labour, thousands of workers capable of digging, lifting, transporting, and processing ore. And even if their tools were advanced, labour would still be essential. They could not bring endless supplies of machinery with them. They would need a workforce that could adapt, learn, and endure. This is where the merging of species begins to make sense. Early humans were strong, resilient, and already adapted to Earth's climate. They could survive in regions that might be hostile to the travellers, but early humans lacked the cognitive structure to perform complex tasks efficiently. They lacked language, memory systems, and the ability to follow intricate instructions. If the visitors needed a labour force, they would have to shape one. This process would not be dramatic or sudden. It would happen slowly through generations. By blending their lineage with early humans, they could create a workforce capable of carrying out mining operations, agriculture, construction, and other essential tasks that would support their settlement on Earth. The golden hunger, then, becomes a practical explanation for why the Anunnaki intervened at all. They were not benevolent gods descending simply to guide humanity. They were a civilization facing crisis, seeking resources and stability. And humans, already living on Earth, offered the potential to become partners or workers in that process. The early shaping of humanity, described in myths as moulding from clay or breathing life into a new form, could have been the refinement of traits needed for cooperative labour. Strong hands to dig, attentive minds to learn, cooperative behaviours to maintain order, and emotional intelligence to form stable communities. The mining sites themselves would have been chosen carefully. Ancient Sumerian texts mention regions like the Abzu, a term later associated with fresh water, but originally suggesting deep places within the earth. Locations in Africa, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Mediterranean hold some of the world's oldest gold deposits. Archaeologists have found ancient mines that date back tens of thousands of years, long before large-scale human civilizations formed. These sites, etched into rock faces and mountains, could reflect the earliest mining operations organised or influenced by the travellers. The travellers might have established work camps near rivers where the water could be used to separate gold from sediment. They might have built structures to protect workers from the sun or rain. They would instruct early humans on how to spot gold-bearing rock, how to carry heavy loads safely, or how to dig without collapsing tunnels. These practical teachings would be remembered by later generations as divine instructions. When a traveller taught someone to break rock with a shaped tool, the human who learned would pass the knowledge forward until the underlying reason for the lesson faded, leaving only the story of a heavenly being teaching the first humans how to use tools. As time passed, the mining operations would expand. More humans would join these efforts, and the travellers would keep adjusting their guidance based on what they observed. They might have taught early communities how to store food for large groups of workers, how to build permanent shelters, or how to create social structures to maintain order. These developments would contribute directly to the emergence of organised settlements and early forms of administration. Not because the travellers wished to create civilization, but because civilization made resource extraction more efficient. The golden hunger would also explain why the travellers stayed on Earth for so long. If their homeworld required continuous shipments of gold, then they would need to maintain a presence on Earth for centuries. They might send expeditions back to Nibiru with loads of processed gold whenever their planet came near enough for travel. Other expeditions would remain behind to continue mining. These groups would form the core of early leadership among the humans who came to know them as teachers or rulers. Humans living under the guidance of the travellers would gradually become more skilled, more organised, and more capable of functioning independently. They might have learned how to identify new gold sites, how to move materials across longer distances, or how to protect mines from natural threats. The travellers would begin stepping back, allowing humans to operate more autonomously. This shift from direct oversight to indirect influence could be the root of myths describing gods withdrawing, disappearing, or returning to the heavens after completing their work. As descendants of both groups grew in number, humans began to inherit traits that made them more adept at problem-solving, communication, and cooperation. These traits, shaped by generations of blending and guidance, would form the cognitive foundation of future civilizations. The Golden Hunger started as a practical need, but eventually became the catalyst for the development of culture, technology, and organized society. Over time, the travelers' role would become less about mining and more about maintaining stability. They would manage conflicts between groups, teach agricultural techniques to support growing populations, and introduce early forms of record-keeping. Each of these actions made mining operations smoother, but they also transformed human society. The stories about rulers who descended from the heavens could reflect those early leaders who still carried direct ancestry from Nibiru. The influence of the travellers on early humans would shape not only physical development, but emotional and social structures. They encouraged behaviours that supported cooperation, discipline, and respect for authority. These emotional traits, passed down through generations, helped larger communities form without constant conflict. Civilizations need shared identity, shared beliefs, and shared purpose. Those ideas may have grown originally from the need to organize thousands of workers under a structured system that kept them fed, sheltered, and focused. It's easy now to read myths describing gods demanding tribute or labour and interpret them through the lens of modern sensibilities. But in the context of survival, the Golden Hunger becomes a practical explanation. The travellers required gold to preserve their world. Humans, shaped through guidance and blending, provided the workforce needed. Over time, what began as necessity grew into culture. Rituals developed to honour those who taught humanity or shaped early society. These rituals later turned into religions. The travellers became deities. Their actions became stories of divine creation or cosmic command. What began as mining became mythology. As the mining operations matured and human populations expanded, the gold exported to Nibiru would help stabilize that distant world. Each passage of Nibiru through the inner solar system might bring renewed contact. Gold would be transported back, knowledge would be exchanged, new travellers might arrive, others might depart. These cycles would continue until the relationship between the two worlds reached a point where humans were capable of sustaining their own civilizations without direct oversight. Eventually, the Golden Hunger would diminish. Perhaps Nibiru stabilized. Perhaps their society changed. Perhaps they developed new methods that no longer required the same resources. Whatever the reason, the traveller's presence on Earth gradually faded. Humans, now able to operate independently, would carry forward the knowledge they had inherited. They would build cities, develop writing systems, and create their own cultures, unaware that the foundation of their societies had been shaped by a practical need from a distant world. The Golden Hunger, then, was not simply about mining. It was the spark that ignited everything that followed. It pushed the travellers to intervene. It brought the two species together. It shaped the development of early humanity. And it set the stage for the next phase of the story, where the lessons left behind continued to guide human civilization long after the travellers had gone, leading us into the next part of this journey, where the memory of their world becomes woven into the structures, ideas, and beliefs that define the earliest empires on Earth. If you imagine the earliest humans staring up at the night sky, you may picture familiar constellations. The same patterns we recognise today. The same bright points of light that draw the attention of anyone who steps outside on a clear evening. But to the people who lived in the first ages after the travellers from Nibiru walked among them, the sky held more than stars. It held memory. Not because they understood celestial mechanics or distant planets, and not because they carried maps of the solar system. They remembered because the travellers taught them to look upward with a purpose. They taught them to watch, to measure, to wait, and to understand that patterns in the sky held meaning. They taught them that light was not just illumination, but information, something to be read, interpreted, and passed down long after the original reason for those lessons had faded from memory. Long before there were astronomers, there were people who quietly counted nights, traced shadows, observed risings and settings, and carved their observations into stone. Many of the oldest artifacts humanity has uncovered, bone notches, carved discs, cave markings, appear at first glance to be decorative. But when studied closely, they align with phases of the moon, eclipses, or the cycles of visible stars. These early records may feel spontaneous or intuitive, but the precision in some of them suggests guidance, not dictation, not teaching in the sense of a classroom, but influence. Encouragement from visitors who had travelled through space long enough to understand that the sky was not random. The travellers from Nibiru didn't simply tell early humans to look at the stars, they showed them. They demonstrated how the sky could be used to measure time, track seasons, and anticipate changes in the environment. These lessons would have been practical at first. A settled community needed to know when to plant seeds, when to harvest, and when rains might come. But over time, the act of watching the sky would take on deeper meaning. Humans began to associate certain stars with events, or ancestors. They started to see the heavens not just as a calendar, but as a story that preserved the memory of another world. When the travellers pointed to the sky and traced the movement of celestial objects, early humans would try to replicate those gestures later, sitting with children, drawing in the dirt, using simple tools to create alignments with the sun or moon. Over generations, what began as demonstrations would become rituals. Families or tribes would gather at specific times of year to observe particular stars. These gatherings, repeated year after year, would slowly take on symbolic significance. Why watch the sky? Because ancestors did. Why count nights? Because that's how order was kept. Why carve patterns? Because someone before them had said it mattered. The original meaning, the memory of Nibiru, became woven into tradition, recognizable only through subtle hints left behind. Some of these hints appear in the earliest temples and structures. Ancient sites across the world show an unusual level of astronomical precision. Stones placed so that light from the sunrise on a particular day of the year falls through a narrow opening. Monuments aligned with solstices or equinoxes. Buildings oriented towards stars that today are barely visible. These alignments seem extraordinary for early civilizations, especially in places where agriculture had only recently begun. The attention to detail suggests that the sky was not simply a curiosity, it was a teacher, and the lessons it held came from a memory much older than the civilizations themselves. Imagine the travellers standing with early humans near a simple stone circle or a stretch of open ground. They show them where the sun rises at midsummer. They mark the spot with stones or branches. Months later, they show them where the sun sets at midwinter. They explain, through gestures and simple sounds, how this knowledge helps measure the passing of seasons. Over time, humans refine these markers into something more permanent. Stones become pillars, branches become carved posts. Temporary alignment becomes architecture, and the memory of the original demonstration becomes a tradition repeated long after the travellers have left. As generations passed, the details faded. The travellers were no longer remembered as people who gave practical instructions. They became figures of legend, those who taught humanity to read the heavens. Their lessons, originally simple, grew into more elaborate rituals as storytellers added new layers to their meaning. In time, priests took over the role of watching the sky, turning the once practical act of observation into a sacred duty. Their work preserved ancient patterns, even if the original reason for those patterns had long since been forgotten. The memory of Nibiru also appears in myths describing a wandering star, a bright object that appears only at certain times, then vanishes for ages. Across many cultures, stories exist of a star that moves against the normal flow of the heavens, returning after long intervals. Some call it a sign, others call it a traveller. A few describe it as a homeland. These stories may not refer to a literal sighting of Nibiru, it would be too distant, too faint, but they reflect a memory of a world that did not follow Earth's patterns. a world remembered through symbolic references rather than precise coordinates. The lessons written in light were not limited to astronomy. The travellers taught early humans how to use reflection and shadow to measure time. Sundials, water clocks, and shadow tracking tools appear earlier in human history than expected. In many cases, they emerge fully formed rather than evolving slowly. These devices suggest that someone introduced the core concepts before humans had developed the surrounding mathematical framework. Over time, humans adapted these tools, refined them, and integrated them into their developing cultures. You can picture a traveller showing an early community how to track shadows using a simple stick. The traveller places a pole in the ground, marks the shadow's position at different times of day, and points out the pattern that emerges. The humans watch closely, memorise the process, and replicate it. Later generations take those marks and turn them into formal measurements, carving them into stone or building structures that preserve the shadow's path. What started as a simple demonstration becomes a foundation for timekeeping. The sky also held stories that helped humans understand life on Earth. The travellers might have used constellations as teaching tools, assigning meaning to patterns of stars to help early humans remember lessons about seasons, floods, or animal migrations. These stories, repeated enough times, became myths. Over time, the constellations evolved into symbols of gods, ancestors, or cosmic forces. But beneath those symbolic layers, there may still lie fragments of the original teachings, lessons written in light, handed down through stories because writing had not yet been invented. Another important aspect of the traveller's lessons involved direction and orientation. Long-distance navigation requires an understanding of celestial markers. The travellers would have known how to use the stars to find their way across the emptiness of space. Teaching humans basic navigation on Earth would naturally involve similar methods. Humans later developed their own techniques, using the North Star, mapping the positions of certain constellations, or tracking the movement of planets. These knowledge systems emerged with surprising sophistication in cultures that seemed too early in development to have discovered them alone. Ancient maps, calendars, and cosmological diagrams often show a complexity that feels out of place. Some early cultures understood precession, the slow movement of Earth's axis, long before modern science described it. Others aligned temples with celestial events that require centuries of careful observation to detect. These anomalies suggest a memory passed down from a source older than the civilizations themselves, a memory that began with those early lessons. Not all of the lessons were functional. Some were philosophical. The travellers from Nibiru might have spoken, through whatever early form of communication was possible, about the fragility of worlds, the balance required to sustain life, or the dangers of environmental decline. These ideas would resonate deeply with humans who depended on seasonal cycles for survival. Over time, these conversations could evolve into moral teachings, forming part of the ethical frameworks of early societies. When ancient texts described gods warning humans to care for the land, to respect the cycles of nature, or to maintain harmony between communities, they might reflect echoes of those early conversations. The travellers, having seen the effects of environmental collapse on their own world, would understand the importance of balance. The memory of those warnings would remain long after the travellers themselves were gone, embedded in stories and rituals that instructed future generations to respect the forces that sustain life. The lessons written in light also influenced how humans interpreted themselves. Early people began to see their stories as part of something larger. The sky was not just a backdrop, it was a reminder, a teacher, a record. The idea that humans had origins beyond Earth may have taken shape slowly, encoded in myths about ancestors coming from the heavens or descending from stars. These myths, found across continents separated by vast distances, share similar themes, a connection that cannot be explained by simple cultural diffusion, a memory that persisted even when the names changed, even when the symbols shifted. As the direct memory of Nibiru faded over generations, What remained was a sense of identity, shaped by those early lessons. Humans began to believe they were connected to the sky, not just physically, through observation, but spiritually and emotionally. They saw themselves as part of a greater story, a lineage that stretched beyond the boundaries of Earth. This sense of cosmic origin became a foundation for many of the world's oldest beliefs. At the same time, the lessons from the travellers influenced the development of leadership. Early rulers often claimed descent from the heavens, not as a way to flaunt authority, but as a reflection of cultural memory. If the first leaders truly were descendants of the travellers, then the association between rulership and the sky would be natural. Over time, this connection became symbolic, but the memory behind it remained, embedded in crowns, headdresses, and symbols associated with leadership. The memory of Nibiru also shaped how ancient civilizations built their earlier centers of worship and knowledge. Temples were often placed on high ground, closer to the sky. Staircases ascended toward the heavens. Ziggurats rose like artificial mountains. Pyramids aligned with stars. These structures were more than architectural achievements. They were attempts to keep the memory alive, attempts to maintain a connection to the place where their ancestors once came from. Even today, when people look at ancient monuments and wonder how such structures were built using simple tools, they might be sensing the echoes of an older knowledge. Not that the travellers built every monument or designed every structure, but that their early lessons gave humans the foundation for engineering principles far earlier than expected. Humans took those lessons and expanded them into feats that still inspire curiosity. As centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the memory of Nibiru remained embedded in small, subtle ways, in myths about wandering stars, in stories of gods who came from the heavens, in calendars aligned with celestial cycles, in rituals performed at sunrise or sunset, in the instinct to look upward when seeking answers. These memories were not always clear or consistent, but they formed a pattern recognized across cultures, suggesting a shared origin far older than written history. Eventually, humans began to explore the sky again, not through stories, but through tools, telescopes, observatories, spacecraft. Each new step feels like an achievement of modern ingenuity, but it may also be the resurfacing of an ancient impulse, a quiet instinct inherited from the travellers who first taught humans to read the light, to trust the sky, and to remember that their story began long before Earth became their home. And as humans continue to explore, to measure and to wonder, the lessons written in light still guide them, connecting the distant past with the world they continue to build, leading smoothly into the next part of this story, where the memory of two worlds begins to shape the earlier cities and the first great civilizations that rose from the blend of those origins. When people today walk through the ruins of humanity's earlier cities, they often see them as the natural outcome of growing populations, villages becoming towns, towns becoming centres of trade, and trade giving rise to larger structures, rituals and systems. That's the picture most textbooks paint. But if you step back and look more carefully at the oldest cities on Earth, a different pattern emerges, one that feels too deliberate, too coordinated, too aligned with the sky, to be the result of slow, accidental development. These cities do not look like communities that simply grew wherever people decided to settle. They look like places built with a memory in mind, a memory whispered from a world that once passed through the distant reaches of our solar system and left behind lessons written in the movement of the stars. Cities like Eridu, Uruk, Babylon, Thebes, Memphis, Caral, Teotihuacan, Göbekli Tepe, and many others have something in common that feels familiar once you know to look for it. They are built according to patterns that mirror the heavens. In some cases, they follow the layout of constellations. In others, their buildings align with solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of specific stars. Some are oriented toward the movements of planets that would have been difficult, almost impossible, for early humans to track accurately without generations of careful observation or knowledge passed down from ancestors who had travelled far beyond Earth's familiar skies. To imagine why ancient builders placed such importance on alignment, you have to return to the period when the travellers from Nibiru first walked among early humans. For them, the sky was not simply a vault of stars but a record, a map, a reminder of where they came from and how their world moved through the universe. Teaching early humans to watch the sky was not only practical, it was cultural. It helped preserve a connection between the two species long after they blended. Those early lessons, originally simple, eventually grew into architectural traditions carried out by descendants who never fully understood their original meaning. When the first communities began to form into larger settlements, the elders who remembered these lessons would advise aligning structures with the heavens, not because it improved trade or farming efficiency, but because that was the pattern their ancestors had taught them. They would tell stories of beings who pointed to the sky and said that the heavens hold the key to understanding life. They would recount memories of the travellers tracing lines in the dirt, connecting stars into shapes representing maps or histories. The details of those stories might fade as generations passed, but the core message remained: build with the sky in mind. Imagine the first settlement taking shape under the guidance of those early descendants. The people gather materials, clay, mud brick, wood, and begin laying out the foundation. Someone walks to the centre of the clearing at dawn and marks where the sun rises. Another marks where it sets. Someone else stands at night and traces the position of the brightest star in the east. These marks guide the placement of the first buildings. The settlement is oriented not toward practical geography, but towards celestial directions. The people do not fully understand why, but they trust the inherited wisdom. As the settlement grows, that orientation becomes tradition. The central structure, often a temple, is built along the axis that once aligned with a significant star. Other buildings fall into place around it like pieces of a puzzle. The entire layout becomes a reflection of the heavens as seen from the ground. Over centuries, these alignments become more sophisticated. Structures rise with carefully angled walls that allow sunlight to illuminate the interior only on particular days of the year. Openings in rooftops and doorways frame specific stars or planetary movements. Rulers commission buildings designed to track the sky, ensuring their power is connected to the same celestial memory. Some ancient cities take this mirroring to extraordinary levels. Teotihuacan, for example, is aligned with the Pleiades, a cluster of stars that holds deep meaning in many cultures around the world. In Sumer, the Pleiades were associated with the Anunnaki. In Greece, they were linked to myths of origin and transformation. In Japan, they became a symbol of unity so strong that their name, Subaru, was chosen to represent a modern company. This widespread significance hints at a shared memory, an echo of a time when the Pleiades mattered not just symbolically, but culturally. The oldest parts of Egypt's monumental architecture also mirror the heavens. The layout of the Giza pyramids matches the three stars of Orion's belt. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point toward Orion and Sirius. Egyptian texts describe the pharaoh's soul ascending to join the gods in the sky, returning to a celestial homeland. These beliefs do not emerge from isolated imagination. They reflect a memory of ancestors who taught that the sky was home, that life originated somewhere beyond Earth. Even in the earliest settlements, long before monumental structures were built, the idea of mirroring the heavens appears repeatedly. Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest large ritual sites ever discovered, is filled with carvings of animals that match constellations visible during the time it was constructed. Archaeologists have noted that its pillars align with the rising of specific stars, suggesting that the builders were not creating a random circle of stones, but a map, a model of the sky on the ground. Why would hunter-gatherers create something so precise, so symbolic, so complex? Unless they were preserving a memory, the idea makes little sense. This pattern of celestial alignment continues across continents and cultures. In the Andes, ancient cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu reflect the movements of the sun and stars with breathtaking precision. In China, early dynasties laid out entire cities according to astronomical principles. In Mesopotamia, temple complexes aligned with planetary cycles long before mathematics was formally developed. In the Indus Valley, entire street grids followed cardinal directions with an accuracy that suggests deliberate planning rather than trial and error. Looking at these cities as mere human inventions misses the deeper thread. They look like reflections of a memory older than the civilizations that built them. A memory passed down through stories told around fires, repeated in rituals, carved into the shapes of temples, embedded in the positions of foundations. A memory of a world whose sky was different, whose seasons moved slowly, whose orbit stretched far beyond Earth's. A memory of Nibiru. Imagine a scene long before written history began. A group of early humans and travellers gather at night outside a simple settlement. The sky stretches above them, clear and bright in a way modern skies rarely are. The travellers point to certain stars and explain, through gestures and drawings, how their planet once moved in relation to these lights. They describe long cycles, slow returns, and a distant homeland illuminated by a sun much smaller in their sky. The humans listen, not fully understanding but remembering. They pass these stories to their children, who pass them to theirs. Eventually the details crumble into myth, but the rituals remain. This is how a city becomes a blueprint of the heavens, not through sudden leaps of genius, but through the steady accumulation of ancient memory. Each generation builds according to what the previous one valued. When the sky holds symbolic meaning, architecture becomes a reflection of that meaning. When the memory of a wandering world remains in stories, the layout of a city becomes a map of the sky. The orientation of early buildings also served practical functions. Structures aligned with the solstices helped track the changing seasons. Temples aligned with specific stars allowed priests to predict floods, droughts, and agricultural cycles. But the practical use does not exclude the symbolic one. Humans often combine necessity with meaning. When something matters deeply enough, it becomes ritual. And when rituals repeat long enough, they become culture. For the descendants of the travellers, aligning cities with the sky was more than tradition. It was a way to preserve connection, a way to honour a world they no longer lived on but still remembered, a way to pass down teachings that otherwise might be lost. Even when the travellers themselves had faded from memory, even when their direct descendants blended entirely into Earth population, the sky continued to hold importance. It was a bridge between what was known and what was forgotten. As civilizations grew and developed their own distinct identities, they added layers of symbolism to their sky-oriented architecture. The Egyptians built pyramids to ensure the pharaoh's soul could ascend to the heavens. The Sumerians constructed ziggurats as stairways between Earth and the sky. The Maya built observatories to track Venus and other celestial bodies. The Greeks crafted entire mythologies around constellations, personifying them as heroes, animals, or gods. In each case, the sky served as a canvas on which humanity projected its origins, beliefs, and hopes. Over time, the original memory of Nibiru became almost unrecognizable. It became wrapped in metaphors, rituals, and symbolic interpretations. But the emotional imprint remained. The instinct to build upward, to align structures with the sky, to connect cities with celestial patterns. These instincts persisted because they were rooted in something deeper than architecture. They were rooted in identity. The earliest rulers often claimed descent from the heavens, not merely as a political strategy, but as a reflection of cultural memory. If the first leaders truly were descendants of the travellers, then the association between leadership and the sky would make sense. Over time, this symbolic connection became psychological. A ruler who aligned their city with the heavens showed legitimacy, wisdom, and respect for the ancient teachings. This pattern appears in Sumer, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and countless other places where celestial alignment defined the legitimacy of kingship. As civilizations expanded, the celestial patterns they mirrored became more complex. They began to incorporate multiple stars, planetary movements, and even processional cycles spanning thousands of years. These patterns became part of temple layouts, royal burials, and architectural symbolism. The sophistication suggests that someone, at some point, understood these cycles far better than later generations did. The knowledge may have come from ancestors who carried direct memories of the travellers' lessons. Over time, those memories evolved into cultural achievements. The cities that mirrored the heavens were not simply places where people lived. They were living records. They were reminders carved into earth and stone. They were echoes of a story that predates history, a story passed through generations of builders who followed patterns they did not fully understand but trusted deeply. The memory of Nibiru remained alive not in words, but in structures, not in books, but in alignments, not in direct recollections, but in the quiet instinct to look upward when shaping the world below. And as these cities rose from the ground, brick by brick, stone by stone, they carried forward the connection between two worlds, guiding humanity into the age when the descendants of both origins began creating symbols, laws, and leadership traditions that still reflect those early lessons, leading naturally into the next part of this story, where the merging of cultures becomes the foundation of civilizations that emerged along the rivers, the mountains, and the fertile plains shaped by this shared past. There comes a moment in every long story when the people who shape the beginning quietly step away, leaving those who remain to decide how the next chapters will be written. For the descendants of the travellers from Nibiru, that moment arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly, not in a single dramatic scene, but in a gradual drift that unfolded across generations. The Great Departure was not an event marked by a single date, or remembered with clear details. It was a fading, a thinning presence, a transition from a time when the teachers, leaders, and architects of early human society still walked among their descendants, to a time when their footsteps grew lighter and finally disappeared altogether. What remained afterward was silence, an absence so profound that ancient civilizations tried to fill it with stories, rituals, and monuments to keep the memory alive. To understand why the travellers left, you have to imagine their world with the same practicality that shaped their arrival. If Nibiru truly followed a slow, wide orbit, then it would not linger near Earth for long. Its warm season near the sun might have lasted centuries, but eventually its path would carry it outward again, into the cold reaches of space where the sunlight thins and the temperatures fall. The travellers who stayed on Earth always knew this. They knew their home world would appear in the sky only rarely. They knew that for their people living on Nibiru, those crossings were opportunities to reconnect, to exchange resources, to stabilise systems that depended on gold. And they knew that one day, when Nibiru approached Earth, for what might be the final time in their era, a choice would have to be made. Some would leave, some would stay, and their reasons would not be simple. The travellers who had lived on Earth for generations, those who had built settlements, raised children, and adapted to Earth's climate, would see this planet as home. They had adjusted their bodies to Earth's gravity, grown accustomed to its shorter years, and built emotional ties with the people who descended from both lineages. Their children spoke languages shaped by the rhythms of this world. Their grandchildren identified with landscapes they could touch, rather than distant stories about Nibiru's long seasons. For these people, leaving Earth would feel like abandoning something sacred, but others would feel differently. They would look at the sky and recognize the faint returning light of their home world. They would feel the pull of memory, places where their ancestors were born, stories told during childhood, traditions that Earth could not replace. They would feel the responsibility to return with resources, knowledge, or children who carried the lineage forward. They would understand that the survival of their people depended on maintaining the connection between the two worlds. For them, departure would not be abandonment, it would be duty. The Great Departure began with quiet preparations, not with ships lined in rows or dramatic ceremonies, but with conversations held in private. with parents explaining to their children that they might soon leave Earth behind, with elders calculating the timing of Nibiru's approach and determining how long they had before the window closed, with engineers inspecting tools and equipment that had survived centuries of use, with leaders weighing the risks of the journey against the consequences of staying. They would have needed to repair whatever vessels they brought during earlier crossings, or build new ones using materials found on Earth. These vessels would not resemble anything imagined in modern stories. They would be functional, durable, and designed for long travel through cold space. They would not rely on explosive thrust or chemical fire, but on slow, steady propulsion, capable of pushing through the vacuum without burning massive amounts of fuel. The preparations would take years, even decades, but the travellers were accustomed to long cycles. They planned not in seasons, but in centuries. The people of Earth, those descended from the merging of the two lineages, would sense that something was changing. Their leaders, once fully present in daily life, would become more distant. They would spend long hours at the edges of settlements, watching the sky or studying old records. They would pass down responsibilities to younger generations. They would slowly step back from their roles in teaching agriculture, architecture, or governance. The shift would not feel abrupt, but it would be noticeable. A quiet withdrawal, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Some of the travellers would choose to stay. Their families were rooted in Earth. Their identities had formed around the landscapes, seasons, and cultures of this world. They would remain behind, blending completely into human society over the course of a few generations. Their children and grandchildren would no longer show clear signs of their ancestry. Their knowledge would be passed orally, becoming part of local traditions. Over time, even that knowledge would fade into story, then into myth, then into fragments barely recognizable. For those who chose to leave, the final days on Earth would be heavy with emotion. They would walk through the places where they once taught early humans to shape tools or observe the sky. They would visit the sites where they had built the first settlements, some still thriving, others reclaimed by nature. They would speak to the people they had guided, assuring them that they were capable of continuing without direct oversight. They would leave behind tools, structures, and instructions, practical knowledge intended to help humans maintain the progress they had made. Some of these remnants would become sacred relics in later centuries, objects too well crafted to fit the technology of the time, preserved in temples or buried with leaders. When the moment came to depart, it would not resemble the dramatic scenes imagined in films. There would be no roaring engines or blazing light. The vessels would rise quietly, lifting from the ground with a calm steadiness shaped by technology, designed for silence and efficiency. Early humans who witnessed it might describe the light around the vessels as soft, diffuse, or shimmering, words chosen not because the light was supernatural, but because there was nothing in their world to compare it to. As the vessels ascended into the dawn or the darkness, depending on the timing, the people watching from below would feel a mixture of awe and sadness. They would see their teachers, leaders, or ancestors disappearing into the sky, perhaps promising to return when the cycles aligned again. But those promises, if they were made, would only echo faintly across generations. Because once Nibiru began its long journey outward again, the travellers would not have been able to return quickly. The orbital period could stretch so far that by the time Nibiru approached Earth again, the descendants of those who left would be generations removed. They might not even know Earth existed. They might not remember the importance of gold or the early mergers that shaped humanity. They might view Earth as legend in the same way humans later viewed the travellers' stories. And for humans on Earth, the absence that followed was profound. The silence began subtly. Festivals that once marked the arrival of teachers or celestial visitors continued, but the figures no longer appeared. Priests looked to the sky, waiting for signs that did not come. Stories passed down through families began to lose details. Symbols carved into stone were repeated without understanding. The memory of the travellers, once sharp and lively, became blurred. People began to ask questions. Where had the sky people gone? Why had they disappeared? Were they angry? Had humanity failed them? Without clear answers, communities crafted their own explanations. Some said the gods had returned to the heavens to watch from afar. Others believed they would come back when humanity proved worthy. Some developed rituals to call them. Others built monuments meant to guide their return. Over centuries the silence deepened. The generation that remembered seeing the travellers faded. Their children grew old. Their grandchildren heard the stories second-hand. The descendants of the travellers who had stayed on Earth blended so fully into the population that their ancestry became invisible. Only faint suggestions, unusual intelligence, leadership ability, or physical traits remained, and even these were lost among the countless qualities that shape human genetics. The absence created space for civilizations to take shape. Without direct guidance, humans experimented, innovated, and developed their own methods. They built cities, crafted laws, wrote myths, and expanded their understanding of the world. Some of their advancements followed the early lessons left behind. Others diverged entirely. The silence was not emptiness. It was an invitation for humanity to grow independently. But the memory of the travellers lingered in small, persistent ways, in stories of gods walking among humans, in myths of beings who taught writing, agriculture, or architecture, in celestial symbols carved into temples, in the idea that leaders descended from the heavens, in the instinct to look upward for answers. These echoes scattered across continents become stronger when placed side by side. They reveal a pattern of remembrance, a thread of continuity spanning thousands of years, a memory of a time when humans and travellers built life together, only for the travellers to depart silently, leaving behind knowledge that shaped every civilization to come. The silence that followed did not erase the travellers' influence. It allowed their legacy to take root in the imagination of humanity. And as Earth's civilizations grew more complex, the echoes of that long departure became woven into the world's oldest stories. Stories that would eventually lead humanity to wonder whether their origins truly lay in the soil beneath their feet, or in the distant journey of a wandering planet whose memory still glimmers faintly in the night sky. And as those civilizations rose, the absence of the travellers shaped something else as well. The emergence of mysteries carved into stone, preserved in rituals, and embedded in structures that still stand today, leading gently into the next part of this story, where the echoes of their presence appear in the clues they left behind. Clues humanity would later uncover in temples, artifacts, texts, and alignments that defy easy explanation. When you walk among the ruins of the world's oldest structures, there is a certain stillness that settles over you. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, but the deeper kind that feels as though the stones themselves are listening, watching, holding something. Even people who don't believe in ancient mysteries often feel it. The sense that these places remember more than they show, that something important happened long before anyone wrote down the first line of history, that the stones are echoing a story they're not fully telling. For the civilizations that rose after the Great Departure, the people who lived among those early structures inherited a world that had already been shaped by hands they no longer knew. They built on foundations they didn't understand, followed patterns they couldn't explain, and honoured traditions whose origins had grown dim. Over generations, the memory of the travellers from Nibiru became folded into myth. Their tools, teachings, and early constructions slowly turned into puzzles, clues left behind without explanations. Those clues didn't look like messages at first glance. They looked like ruins, artifacts, symbols, alignments, and techniques that didn't match the expected timeline of human development. They seemed out of place, too advanced for the eras they came from, too mysterious to attribute to chance. As historians and archaeologists uncovered these remnants in modern times, they often struggled to fit them into the narrative of gradual progression. But for someone willing to step back and see the story in its original scale, these fragments begin to look like echoes, quiet reminders of a time when two worlds briefly shared a path. Some of the most striking clues are the stones themselves. Not their age, though many are older than expected, but the precision with which they were shaped. In places like Sumer, Egypt, Peru, and parts of the Indus Valley, early civilizations created stone blocks with surfaces so smooth and angles so exact that even today, engineers pause when examining them. The question often asked is how early societies still learning agriculture or basic metallurgy could shape stone with such expertise. But imagine a time when the descendants of the travellers still lived among early humans. They would have taught techniques not through lectures but through demonstration, showing how to split stone along natural fracture lines, how to apply heat to make a surface crack cleanly, how to use leverage and counterweight to lift heavy materials. These techniques passed down through generations would survive as habits even after the original reasons behind them were forgotten. Over time, as tools changed and knowledge faded, the methods would become less precise, but the early structures, those shaped during the time of guidance, would remain as silent examples of a skill level that seems out of place. The stones become echoes of lessons once given by people who had already mastered materials far more difficult than anything found on Earth. Other clues appear in the symbols carved into walls, pillars, and tablets. The world's earliest writing systems emerge with startling complexity. Cuneiform, for example, appears fully formed, with no long progression of simpler symbols leading up to it. The same is true for Egyptian hieroglyphs. Instead of emerging slowly, as writing typically does, these systems seem to appear suddenly, as if someone provided template. One way to imagine it is to picture a traveller showing early humans how to record information using simple marks, shapes, or combinations of symbols. A traveller might draw a sign representing water, another representing a person, and another representing time. These symbols, used by early humans to keep track of resources or tasks, would become a foundation. Over generations, the system would expand, refined by humans who adapted it to their culture. Writing becomes a tool not only for storage of information, but for the expression of identity and belief. The symbol itself transforms, but the spark that created it remains an echo of a distant lesson. There are other symbols that appear everywhere: stars, suns, crescents, wings, discs floating above figures, beings shown descending from the sky. Scholars often interpret these as religious or metaphorical images, and perhaps they are. But when you compare them across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, the similarity becomes difficult to ignore. If these symbols were simply coincidence, they shouldn't be so consistent in their meaning. Yet they are. A disc with wings appears in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and parts of Central America. A figure shown with rays around its head appears in Sumer, India, Greece, and across the ancient Mediterranean. A star inside a circle appears in places where the cultures had no recorded contact. To ancient humans, these symbols represented the sky. They represented beings associated with the heavens, and to people with no understanding of astronomy or distant planets, the simplest way to describe someone who came from another world was to draw them with light around their heads or wings beside them, not to imply bird-like features, but to indicate descent. These symbols aren't instructions or messages. They are memories carved into stone, memories of the travellers, simplified through generations of retelling. Some of the most intriguing clues come from the structures that track celestial movements. The alignments of ancient monuments are often described as coincidental, but when examined more closely, they follow patterns that required long-term observation, the kind that would be difficult for early humans to achieve without assistance. Precession of the equinoxes, for example, is a cycle requiring nearly 26,000 years to observe fully. Yet structures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley show awareness of it. How could societies that were barely developing agriculture have known about such slow astronomical motion? If their ancestors had been taught the basics of celestial navigation by travellers who lived according to cycles far longer than Earth's, then these alignments become less mysterious. They become preservation, a way to honour the lessons given by people who understood the sky intimately. Over time, as the original meanings faded, the alignments remained. Priests and builders copied what earlier generations had done without knowing why. The stones kept the memory alive even when the reason was gone. Clues also appear in the sudden leaps of technology seen throughout early civilizations. Metalworking emerged rapidly in several regions, with techniques that allowed early societies to create bronze, a material far more advanced than simple copper or stone. Agriculture appeared in multiple regions with techniques that suggest guidance rather than trial and error. The first irrigation systems in Mesopotamia were so complex that some researchers still struggle to understand how they were designed so early. These advancements don't look like random human invention. They look like knowledge adapted from earlier lessons taught by people who had already mastered the challenges of survival on multiple worlds. The travellers would not have handed over advanced technology. They would have taught fundamental principles, how to work with fire, how to channel water, how to store food, how to build with stone. These basics become the foundation for everything that followed, and the speed of early development reflects the influence of those first teachers. Archaeologists also find artifacts that seem older than they should be. Stone tools appear in layers of earth far deeper than expected. Mining tunnels in parts of Africa date back tens of thousands of years. Some of these mines contain materials that early humans were not expected to value or use. Gold in particular appears to have been mined long before it became useful for ornamentation or trade. This is often explained as coincidence or misinterpretation. But if the travellers needed gold for atmospheric engineering on Nibiru, these ancient mines suddenly make sense. They become evidence, echoes of early extraction done long before humans developed writing or large-scale organisation. In addition to physical artifacts, linguistic clues also remain. Many ancient languages contain words that refer to beings from the sky, not metaphorically but literally. Words meaning those who descended, those who came from above, or people of the heavens, appear across unrelated cultures. These terms are embedded in myths, prayers, and titles for rulers who claim descent from the sky. Over time, the literal meaning became symbolic, but the origin remained. Even in modern languages, the instinct to associate intelligence, divinity, and origins with the sky remains strong. People look upward for inspiration, guidance, and answers, perhaps without realizing they are following a habit rooted in the earliest lessons from beings who descended in a time before memory. Another echo appears in the way early societies built myths around floods, disasters, and dramatic environmental shifts. Nearly every ancient culture has a flood story. These stories often describe beings who warned humanity, helped some survive, or guided them afterward. While floods certainly occurred naturally, the consistency of these stories suggests coordination. If the travellers saw signs of environmental instability, storms, rising waters, shifting climates, they might have warned their descendants to move to higher ground or prepare for certain conditions. These warnings, passed down through generations, turned into myths describing divine intervention. Temples built on high ground, structures elevated above floodplains, and cities designed around river cycles all reflect knowledge of environmental patterns that early humans should not have possessed. These architectural choices become clues, subtle hints of lessons taught long before recorded history began. Among the most mysterious clues are the objects that seem slightly too advanced for their era, carvings that show tools decades or centuries before archaeology expects them, models that resemble aerodynamic shapes, mathematical sequences hidden in temple measurements, calendars that track planetary cycles far more accurately than expected. These anomalies are often explained away as coincidence or misinterpretation, but when seen as echoes of a time when travellers shared their knowledge with early humans, these artifacts look like preserved fragments, small pieces of a much larger story, carried forward imperfectly but still visible. Even the concept of kingship in early civilizations appears to be one of these echoes. The earliest kings of Sumer were described as beings who descended from heaven. Their lifespans were recorded as extraordinarily long, not because the scribes were exaggerating for effect, but because they were recording memories of leaders who were not entirely human by modern standards. Over time, as these long-lived leaders died out, human rulers inherited their positions. But the tradition that kingship was a gift from the heavens remained. It echoed the period when the travellers guided early societies directly, then slowly withdrew as humans became capable of ruling themselves. The Great Departure left behind more than ruins or symbols. It left behind questions so compelling that thousands of years later, people still feel drawn to search for answers. Why do the world's oldest cities follow celestial patterns? Why do so many cultures describe visitors from the sky? Why do early technologies appear suddenly? Why do ancient texts record lifespans far beyond what is biologically plausible? Why do monuments align with star systems that no longer match the sky of their era? These questions aren't accidents. They are the edges of a story that has been fragmented over time. The echoes in stone, clay, and tradition are the remnants of a relationship that shaped humanity during its earliest days. They are the clues left behind by a civilization that moved on, trusting that humans could continue on their own. And as those clues accumulated, forming puzzles for future generations to solve, humanity eventually reached a point where it began to question not only the past but the future as well, wondering whether the sky still held traces of that ancient partnership, leading directly into the next part of this story, where the search for the travellers becomes intertwined with the rise of scholars, skeptics, astronomers, and the early seekers who tried to understand why the heavens still felt like home. When the earliest civilizations began looking up at the night sky with more than simple wonder, something quiet started to change in the way humanity understood itself. For thousands of years, the sky had been a place of stories, rituals, and memory. People saw in it the reflections of their ancestors, the movements of gods, and the reminders of teachings that had long since lost their original context. But as the generations passed and societies grew more complex, a new type of person emerged. Someone who looked at the heavens not only with reverence, but with curiosity sharpened into a tool. These were the early scientists, the first skeptics, and the thinkers who believed that the sky held secrets not yet understood. They did not deny the old stories. In many cases, they respected them deeply, but they approached those stories with a different attitude. They wanted to measure, to calculate, to compare, to understand why the stars moved the way they did, not just what those movements meant symbolically. They asked questions without fear that the answers might challenge long-held beliefs. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, humanity began shifting from memory to investigation, from inherited knowledge to inquiry. Yet even as this new mindset grew, the older echoes remained. They weren't erased. They were simply absorbed. The scientists and skeptics of early civilizations stood on foundations shaped by lessons from a time when the travellers from Nibiru had taught humans to read the sky like a map. Those ancient teachings, softened through myth, still influenced the way scholars approach the heavens. The idea that the sky held meaning was so deeply embedded in culture that even the first rational thinkers assumed there must be patterns worth studying. They simply chose to look for those patterns with tools rather than rituals. Imagine one of those early scholars standing on the rooftop of a temple in Mesopotamia. The air is crisp, the stars bright, the sky clear enough that every constellation stands out sharply. Below, the city sleeps. Above, the scholar draws lines with their mind, connecting the positions of stars remembered from nights before. They track the movement of Jupiter or Venus, noting where the planet rises in relation to the horizon. They carve their observations into clay tablets, creating records that will outlast their own lifetimes. These records do not merely preserve data, they preserve the transition from ancient memory to analytical study. But even as these scholars advanced, they carried a problem that none of them could fully solve. There were secrets in the sky, patterns, exceptions, irregularities, that didn't fit neatly into the theories they created. The precession of the equinoxes, for example, puzzled early astronomers. They observed slight shifts in the stars' positions from generation to generation. These shifts were too slow for a single lifetime to track clearly, yet somehow their societies knew how to anticipate them. They built temples aligned with stars that would only sit in the right place thousands of years earlier. How could they have known? Scientists of the ancient world wondered about this quietly, noting the discrepancy, but leaving it unresolved. Later generations of astronomers would ask the same questions. How did ancient cultures understand cycles that take nearly 26,000 years to complete? Why did temple alignments match skies that no longer existed? Why were early calendars so accurate, sometimes more accurate than those developed centuries later? These questions formed the heart of skepticism. Not skepticism aimed at dismissing the old stories, but skepticism aimed at understanding them. As knowledge expanded, skepticism became a tool for preservation rather than destruction. Scholars examined myths like the Epic of Creation, Sumerian king lists, and stories of gods descending from the heavens. They compared them with astronomical records, trying to separate metaphor from memory. Some skeptics concluded that the stories were symbolic. Others believed they contained factual observations woven into myth. But beneath their debates lay a consistent theme. The heavens were important to early humans for reasons too deep to dismiss lightly. Modern skepticism often imagines itself as the opposite of belief. But in the ancient world, the two existed side by side. A Sumerian priest might spend the day tracking planetary movements with uncanny precision, then recite hymns about celestial beings at night. An Egyptian scribe could calculate the flooding of the Nile based on star risings, then write myths describing the sky as a realm of divine travellers. Early Chinese astronomers predicted eclipses with extraordinary accuracy, yet still described the heavens as a realm where dragons swam among the stars. These scholars lived comfortably in a world where empirical observation and inherited story walked hand in hand. Part of the reason this balance existed is that the clues the travellers left behind were subtle enough to allow both interpretations. The alignments of structures, the complexity of early calendars, the sudden appearance of writing systems, they could be seen as evidence of early genius, or as echoes of a deeper origin. Scientists studied these anomalies, skeptics questioned them, and neither group fully dismissed the other. As time passed and civilizations rose into new forms, the nature of skepticism changed. Scholars began organizing knowledge into categories: astronomy, geometry, mathematics, philosophy. Observations became more standardized. Some thinkers began challenging the old stories more openly. They argued that the gods described in myths were metaphors, not literal beings. They suggested that the sky's movements were natural patterns, not messages. But even as they built these arguments, there was something they could not explain away. The stars themselves, their positions, their cycles, their unusual alignment with ancient monuments, their presence in myths across cultures separated by oceans, the way certain stars held special significance for civilizations that had no reason to share traditions, the way the Pleiades, Orion, Sirius, and other bright markers appear again and again in stories of creation, descent, and guidance. Some scientists concluded that the similarity was coincidence. Others believed there must have been ancient contact between distant cultures. But a small number, quietly without making bold claims, considered that the similarities might reflect an origin story older than the first cities, an origin that science had not yet explained. They studied the sky with instruments rather than stories, yet their results sometimes mirrored the old myths more closely than they expected. As skepticism matured, it brought with it the desire to test. Early astronomers built instruments to track star positions more accurately. They created observatories, some simple, some intricate. They refined calendars, corrected calculations, and developed predictions. With each improvement, they grew more confident in their ability to understand the heavens without relying on ancient stories. Yet the deeper they looked, the the more questions they found. One mystery that perplexed ancient astronomers was the wandering stars, planets that moved unpredictably compared to the fixed stars. The travellers from Nibiru, if their descendants remained among humans long enough, might have explained these movements in earlier generations. But by the time professional astronomy emerged, the old teachings had faded. Scientists had to rediscover everything themselves, layer by layer. When they finally understood planetary motion, some noticed something else. There were gaps, oddities, deviations. For centuries, astronomers speculated about additional planets, unseen bodies whose gravitational pull affected others. Even in modern times, the hypothesis of Planet X still lingers in scientific discussions, not because of myth, but because of mathematics. Something pulls at the edges of the solar system. Something shapes the orbits of distant objects. Something sits out there, quiet and unseen. The skeptics debate whether this body truly exists. The scientists analyse the data. Neither side knows the full answer, but the fact that a hidden world remains plausible is itself an echo, one that resonates strangely with the oldest stories of a wandering planet that approaches the sun only rarely. Another group of scientists approached the question from a different angle: genetics. When researchers began mapping the human genome, they found patterns that raised more questions than they answered. Humans seemed to undergo a sudden burst of cognitive and developmental changes around the same time early civilizations formed. Some scholars described it as a rapid acceleration in mental capacity. Others saw it as a subtle but distinct branching from earlier hominin lines. Skeptics argue that this is simply part of natural evolution. Scientists explore the data without bias. But the timing, the speed, and the nature of these changes puzzled many researchers. It looked less like gradual evolution and more like a series of adjustments, as if something influenced the development of early humans at a crucial moment. Archaeologists found similar puzzles in the material record. The sudden appearance of large cities in Mesopotamia, the abrupt rise of writing systems, the unexpected sophistication of early engineering, the rapid creation of calendars aligned with celestial cycles, the way certain myths seem to describe actual events, not metaphorically, but with details that didn't match the vocabulary of symbolism. The skeptics pressed these questions. Scientists tested them. Storytellers wove them into new interpretations, yet none of the answers fully resolved the mystery. Some scholars noted that ancient cultures attributed their knowledge to those who came from the sky. Skeptics dismissed this as metaphor. Scientists noted the consistency. Neither group could fully explain the ubiquity of this idea. Why did so many early societies describe their ancestors as travellers from the heavens? Why did they build cities aligned with stars? Why did they preserve stories of beings who taught writing, agriculture, or architecture? The secrets in the sky are not just the stars themselves. They are the questions that refuse to disappear. Throughout history, a small number of thinkers, astrologers, philosophers, astronomers, and mathematicians suspected that humanity's origins were more complex than the stories told by priests or rulers. Some proposed lost civilizations. Others imagined ancient migrations across continents. A few dared to consider that Earth's earliest teachers did not originate here at all. As scientific tools improved, some of these questions resurfaced in new forms. Telescopes revealed distant planets. Spectroscopy showed that stars contained elements found on Earth. Space probes detected organic molecules on other worlds. Each of these discoveries made the idea of life elsewhere in the universe seem less far-fetched. Yet modern skepticism also became more rigid. Many scientists insisted that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. They asked for physical proof of ancient travellers, artifacts unmistakably beyond human capability, or chemical signatures pointing to off-world origins. These demands were reasonable. They were the product of a system designed to avoid mistakes, but they also created a tension. Myths spoke in fragments. Archaeology spoke in artifacts. Astronomy spoke in numbers. Genetics spoke in sequences. None of these languages fully overlapped, and between them, something slipped through the cracks. The secrets in the sky, the echoes of Nibiru, the clues left behind, they were scattered, incomplete, softened by time. Enough to hint, not enough to prove. So the skeptics waited, the scientists measured, the storytellers remembered, and generation by generation, humanity expanded its reach closer to the sky itself. When humans finally left Earth again, not as stories, but as astronauts, they carried with them the weight of these ancient questions. They orbited the planet, walked on the moon, and sent probes to other worlds. But even as they explored the solar system, something in them echoed an older impulse. They weren't just reaching outward. They were searching for something familiar. A memory buried so deep that no single person could articulate it, but many felt. Why does the sky feel like home? Why do humans instinctively look upward for meaning? Why do ancient stories place our origins among the stars? These questions linger, not because science cannot answer them, but because they belong to a story that was never fully preserved. A story interrupted by the Great Departure and softened by the silence that followed. And as humanity's understanding deepened, these questions led directly into the next part of this story, where myth and measurement come together, where observers, theorists, and dreamers explore not only where humanity came from, but whether the wandering world that shaped our earliest ancestors still moves quietly beyond the reach of our eyes. There is a strange feeling that settles over people when they begin to look at the oldest stories and the oldest evidence at the same time. Something quiet, something unsettling in a gentle way. A sense that the world has been repeating a message for thousands of years and that we may have only just begun to notice it. When you place myth and measurement side by side, one built from stories, the other from data, they begin to form a shape that neither could create alone. They start to describe a possibility that is both simple and overwhelming. The possibility that humanity is not only the product of Earth, but also the inheritor of another world. That humans did not simply emerge here, that they arrived gradually, carried by the footsteps, teachings, and genetics of those who once travelled between worlds. The idea sounds dramatic when stated plainly, yet it becomes softer, calmer, more grounded when you look at how myth and measurement whisper toward the same point without ever quite touching. Myths, for example, tell us about gods, ancestors, and beings who came from the heavens to shape humanity. Measurement tells us about sudden leaps in cognition, unexplained accelerations in development, and cultural patterns that appear far earlier than expected. Myth speaks in symbols, measurement speaks in numbers. Yet both seem to circle the same unanswered question. What if humanity carries memories older than Earth itself? Not literal memories, but faint traces. Stories passed down, instincts inherited, knowledge encoded not in clear language, but in the structure of our minds, the shape of our cultures, and the direction of our curiosity. When ancient people described their origins, they rarely pointed downward toward the soil beneath their feet. They pointed upward. They used phrases like, those who descended, those who came from the sky, or the people who travelled between worlds. These were not fringe beliefs. They were central parts of early civilizations, repeated across continents separated by oceans and centuries. Skeptics often argue that these similarities arise because people everywhere look at the sky with the same awe. But awe alone does not create detailed origin stories that match so closely. Awe does not explain why ancient societies built cities aligned with constellations they claimed represented home. Awe does not account for the precision of early astronomical knowledge, or the sudden appearance of writing systems capable of recording complex stories from their very first inscriptions. These myths, taken seriously, suggest a connection to something beyond Earth. But measurement adds its own quiet voice to the discussion. It shows that early humans experienced dramatic changes in brain structure, communication, and problem-solving ability over relatively short periods of time, it shows that the earlier civilizations appear almost fully formed, with administrative systems, agricultural methods, and architectural traditions that seem to have arrived far earlier than expected. Measurement asks, how could this happen so quickly? Myth answers, someone taught us. Measurement asks, why did early humans look upward for their origins? Myth answers, because that's where our ancestors came from. Measurement asks, why do stories of sky beings appear across every major ancient culture? Myth answers, because they remembered the visitors who shaped them. These two ways of understanding the world, mythic and scientific, are often framed as opposites, but when you examine them closely, they look more like two halves of a larger story. One half, emotional, symbolic, and shaped by memory. The other half, analytical, precise, and shaped by observation. And when the two align, they begin to suggest a possibility that is neither mystical nor purely material. It is simply an extension of what humanity already knows. Life adapts, life travels, life spreads, life survives in ways deeper and more varied than our current understanding allows. Imagine, for a moment, a long chain of events stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. Early humans on Earth interacted gradually with travellers from Nibiru. They shared knowledge, language, and eventually lineage. These interactions shaped who humans became. Over time, the travellers departed, leaving behind a species capable of surviving independently. Humans adapted to Earth, built civilizations, created myths, and eventually developed tools to observe the universe. But embedded within their cultural memory remained a faint awareness that they had once been part of something larger, a partnership between two worlds, a blending of two species. As civilization matured, people began trying to answer questions about their origins using reason rather than story. They developed early astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and measurement. They studied the movements of the stars and discovered patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. They observed the human mind and noticed its unusual capabilities. They uncovered ancient structures whose precision defied the expected technological limits of their time. These discoveries created tension. Some scholars concluded that ancient myths were symbolic stories about natural forces. Others believed that the myths reflected real events remembered imperfectly. The division between myth and measurement grew wider, not because the two were incompatible, but because people believed they had to choose one or the other. The memory of humanity's dual origin softened into metaphor, while scientific inquiry focused solely on quantifiable evidence. But the pattern remained. It never went away. Every time scientists measured something unexpected in the human record, a sudden cognitive leap, an early monument aligned with stars, a genetic anomaly, they encountered a puzzle that did not quite fit into the standard narrative. Every time archaeologists uncovered tools or structures older than the development models allowed, they added new questions to the list. Every time astronomers noticed gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system, they speculated quietly about unseen worlds. And every time linguists found similarities in myths from distant cultures, they wondered how these ideas travelled so far without contact. These questions do not prove that humanity came from Nibiru. They don't prove that the travellers shaped human evolution in a deliberate way, but they create a space where the idea becomes plausible, not as a fantasy, but as an interpretation that fits the evidence more cleanly than the assumption that everything developed in isolation. The mythic view says that humans were shaped by visitors from the sky. The scientific view says that human development contains anomalies suggesting external influence. The combined view says that humanity may have inherited qualities from another world. Some researchers and thinkers have explored this possibility cautiously. They note that certain genetic markers in humans look older than expected. They point out that human communication, cooperative behaviour and symbolic thinking emerged with remarkable speed. They compare tool development across early populations and note the suddenness of innovation. They examine ancient structures and calculate the astronomical knowledge required to build them. They study myths and find consistent themes about descent, guidance, and departure. Each of these clues looks small when examined alone, but together they form a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore. One of the most intriguing pieces of the puzzle appears not in myth or archaeology, but in psychology. Humans possess instincts that do not entirely match their environment. The fear of deep water, for example, appears across cultures, even in societies far from oceans. The fascination with light in the sky, the instinct to track cycles, the emotional pull towards stories of descent, all of these traits appear universal. They suggest memories older than earthbound experience. Memories embedded not in narrative but in the structure of the human mind. Another piece comes from humanity's relationship with time. Humans experience time differently from many species, with an unusual capacity to imagine long-term futures, build multi-generational projects, and conceive of cycles lasting centuries or millennia. This capacity might reflect inheritance from ancestors whose own world followed cycles far longer than Earth's. People who lived according to seasons that stretched into centuries rather than months. The idea that humans might be visitors, or at least partly descended from visitors, becomes less strange when you consider that humans today are preparing to do the same thing. Humanity has launched probes to distant planets. Humans have walked on the moon. Plans exist for settlements on Mars. The instinct to explore beyond Earth does not feel like a new invention. It feels like a memory resurfacing, a return to a path walked long ago by ancestors whose footsteps humanity now feels compelled to follow. If humans eventually settle other worlds, they will carry with them stories, knowledge, and adaptations. Their descendants born on new planets will grow up viewing Earth as myth, history, or homeland. They may eventually forget the details and remember only fragments. They may create stories to fill the gaps. And their descendants might one day ask whether they truly came from the world beneath their feet, or whether their ancestors journeyed from somewhere else. In this way, humanity today may be living the midpoint of a story rather than its beginning. A story that started long before Earth became the central stage. A story that includes travellers from a wandering world who shaped early humans, then departed, leaving behind a species destined to rediscover its own origins. People sometimes fear the idea that humans might not be entirely native to Earth. But the truth is softer than that. If humanity carries the legacy of another world, it does not diminish its connection to this one. It deepens it. It means that humans adapted, survived, and grew on Earth while carrying echoes of somewhere else. It means that Earth became home, even if it wasn't the first. It means that humanity is a bridge between worlds, shaped by both. Between myth and measurement, this possibility becomes neither fantasy nor certainty. It becomes a quiet question humming beneath the surface of civilization. Could we be the visitors? Could humanity's origins stretch beyond this planet in ways that cannot be proven with a single artifact or explained with a single story? Could the instinct to explore the sky be a memory passed down from ancestors who once travelled between worlds? Whether the answer is yes or no, the question itself continues to shape humanity's pursuit of knowledge. It motivates scientists to explore distant planets. It drives skeptics to examine evidence rigorously. It inspires storytellers to preserve myth. And it pulls humanity forward into a future where the line between Earth and the sky becomes thinner with each generation. And as we step further into that future, the question leads gently into the last part of this journey, the part where the memory of Nibiru becomes not only a story of the past, but a reflection of why humanity continues to search the stars, always looking for something that feels familiar, something that feels like home. There is a feeling that drifts through human history like a quiet current, something that does not announce itself, something without sharp edges or loud explanations. It lingers instead in the places people rarely examine closely, in the instinct to look upward, in the stories told at night, in the sense that the world is part of something larger, older, and still unfinished. You can find that feeling everywhere, from the first carvings in stone to the most advanced telescopes orbiting Earth today. It's a thread, almost invisible, yet strong enough to guide thousands of generations without snapping. If you trace that thread with patience, it leads not only through civilizations, myths, or monuments, but through the quiet spaces between them, between memory and longing, between evidence and intuition, between Earth and a world that once passed near enough to shape the course of human destiny. That world, the wandering planet remembered in stories as Nibiru, may no longer be visible, but the influence it left behind has never entirely faded. It remains woven into humanity's decisions, curiosities, and dreams, and if the past is any guide, it will continue shaping the future in ways subtle but persistent. One of the clearest signs of this thread appears in humanity's relationship with the sky itself. For most species on Earth, the night sky is simply background, something that does not affect daily life. But humans treat it differently. People study it, map it, name it, align buildings with it, record its patterns, and use it to measure time. They tell stories about it, navigate by it, pray toward it, and search within it for explanations that have nothing to do with survival. This behavior is so normal for humans that it rarely draws attention, yet it is deeply unusual when viewed from a broader biological perspective. Humans, without knowing why, behave like descendants of a people who once depended on celestial navigation, long cycles, and slow-moving seasons. People whose original world moved in patterns far longer than Earth's quick loops around the sun. The fascination with long-term cycles, great years, ages, epochs, resembles the instincts of a species shaped by ancestors who lived according to a calendar measured not in months, but in centuries. That sense of time persists even though Earth never required it. It lingers because the thread still pulls gently at the edges of memory. Another part of that thread appears in humanity's desire to build upward. Early civilizations raised ziggurats, pyramids, towers, observatories, and temples designed to reach closer to the sky. Later societies built cathedrals, minarets, domes, and spires. Modern cities rise with steel and glass, pushing higher with every decade, as if humans are trying to feel closer to something above them, even if they cannot name what that something is. This awareness of height, this longing to rise, does not fit cleanly into the needs of a species whose evolution took place on plains, forests, and riverbanks. It fits a species carrying a faint instinct from ancestors who lived under a sky they used as reference, a sky that connected their world to Earth through long, repeating arcs. The thread also runs through humanity's emotional structure. People carry a sense of homesickness for places they've never visited. They describe certain landscapes, skies, or moments as familiar, even when they have no logical reason to feel that way. A sunset can evoke a feeling older than the person watching it. A quiet night can stir a longing that does not belong to any particular memory. Some emotions arrive uninvited, carrying hints of something distant. These feelings do not prove that humanity came from another world, but they align gently with the idea that humans inherited fragments of a story they did not begin writing. You can see another part of that thread in humanity's instinct to explore. Human beings seek the edges of maps, the tops of mountains, the depths of oceans, and the limits of technology. They cross deserts, climb cliffs, tunnel through rock, and send machines into places they cannot reach. They expand outward, generation after generation, as if compelled by a memory of ancestors who once travelled between worlds. This instinct to explore is so strong that it has shaped entire eras of history, driven countless innovations, and influenced humanity's understanding of itself. Even when exploration brings danger, isolation, or uncertainty, humans continue to move outward. They do this not because Earth demands expansion, but because something within them leans toward the unknown. It is the same impulse that once guided the travellers from Nibiru as they searched for resources, stability, or survival. That impulse, passed through countless generations, may be one of the clearest signs of the thread that still connects humanity to its wandering origins. You can also find this thread in the way humans respond to the possibility of other worlds. The discovery of exoplanets, once a dream, has become routine. Scientists now estimate that most stars in the galaxy have planets. Some of those worlds fall within zones where life could exist, yet the reaction to these discoveries is strangely emotional, not merely scientific. People feel excitement, fear, curiosity, and recognition when they hear about planets beyond the solar system. They imagine what life might look like there, how it might think, how it might feel. They wonder whether those worlds could be visited, explored, or understood. This reaction is telling. It suggests that humanity's fascination with other worlds is not simply intellectual, it is personal. People react to exoplanets the way someone reacts to the mention of a distant relative they've never met. With interest, with longing, with the feeling that something important may be found there. If humanity had no connection to any world but Earth, this emotional response might not exist. But it does. It persists. And it aligns with the idea that the thread remains unbroken. Modern science, without intending to, has strengthened this connection. Telescopes orbiting Earth and sitting on mountaintops collect light from distant galaxies. They bring the universe into focus with a clarity ancient people could not imagine. They show worlds forming, stars collapsing, and planets drifting. They reveal that the universe is full of movement, not a static stage, but a vast landscape in which worlds travel just as Nibiru once did. These discoveries reinforce something humans have always felt. The sky is not distant. It is familiar. It is part of the same story. Even the technologies humans build today echo ancient instincts. Satellites trace paths around Earth the way early humans imagined gods or ancestors moving across the heavens. Spacecraft leave the planet and carry objects, plaques, recordings, tools, that future generations might misunderstand the same way humans misunderstood some of the artifacts left by the travellers. The parallels are subtle but striking. If humanity continues along this path, it is not difficult to imagine a future where humans settle on other worlds. They will adapt to new environments, develop new traditions, create new stories, and eventually forget some of the details of their Earth origin. Their descendants living centuries later might describe Earth in mythic language: blue rivers, green continents, a sky with fast-changing seasons. If those descendants ever returned to Earth after a long separation, they would arrive as travellers from the sky. Their history would look similar to the stories humans tell today about the travellers from Nibiru. In this sense, humanity is not simply connected to the wandering planet of the past. Humanity is becoming its own wandering civilization. The thread that connects humans to Nibiru is also guiding them toward becoming what their ancestors once were: explorers, migrants, settlers of new worlds, carriers of knowledge that will eventually be misunderstood by future generations. This thread is not about nostalgia or longing. It is about continuity, an unbroken line of movement, curiosity, adaptation, and survival. A pattern that stretches from the distant past into the distant future. A pattern that reflects not only where humanity came from, but where it is going. Even the oldest myths seem to recognize this continuity. They do not describe humanity as static. They describe journeys, arrivals, departures, and returns. They describe cycles, not endings. They describe knowledge passed through generations by beings who once walked among humans, then stepped away, trusting that humanity would continue without them. Those stories do not feel like final chapters. They feel like beginnings. As modern people look for signs of life elsewhere, they repeat this ancient cycle. They search the sky for radio signals, chemical signatures, and patterns in the movement of distant planets. They listen quietly, hoping for something familiar, a voice, a rhythm, a signal that feels like an echo of an older time. They are doing, in a modern way, exactly what early humans did when they looked at the stars and waited for the return of their visitors. The tools have changed, the instinct has not. And if humans eventually receive a signal from another world, or send one that is received, they will become the travellers in the next chapter of this long story. They will become the ones whose memory is carried forward by new civilizations. They will become the ancestors who visited, guided, or shaped others. The thread will continue, woven through new stories, new myths, and new measurements. The connection to the wandering planet did not end with the great departure. It did not break when the travellers left. It remained, quiet and subtle, embedded in the core of what it means to be human. It lives in curiosity, movement, imagination, and the desire to understand origins. It lives in the feeling that the sky is not empty but familiar. It lives in the instinct to explore. It lives in the knowledge that humanity's story is not confined to Earth, even if Earth became the place where that story grew. And as this long journey continues, the thread that connects humanity to Nibiru remains steady, a reminder that origins are rarely simple, that memory can survive across ages, and that sometimes the stories whispered by ancient civilizations carry truths that measurement is only beginning to rediscover.